Why it sucked to be a child in Victorian England. Welcome to Victorian London, 1850. The streets stink of horse dung and sewage. Queen Victoria sits on her fancy throne while you're born into a world that's about as child-friendly as a meat grinder. Bad luck, friend. You're a child in an era when that's the absolute worst thing to be. Childhood in Victorian England wasn't about toys and birthday parties, it was about staying alive. If you even thought that was worth the bother. While the rich were obsessing over which fork to use at dinner, kids as young as 4 were working until they dropped. In this grim tale, you'll discover why being born poor usually meant you'd be dead before your 5th birthday. You'll see how children were just tiny adults with all the work but none of the rights. But surely rich children had it good. Not so fast. Even they faced their own special brand of Victorian misery, just with nicer clothes while they suffered. So brace yourself for 15 reasons why being a child in Victorian England was hell on earth. What you're about to learn will make you pathetically grateful to have been born in an era with child labour laws and basic sanitation. First stop, birth in a slum with death lurking around every corner. And honestly, an early grave might have been the kinder option, considering what waited for those who survived. 1. You could be born in a slum and die before age 5. Welcome to your birth in London, 1850. Your mum's exhausted from labour with nothing but gin for pain relief. The midwife washes you in water that's basically cholera soup. First day alive, first deadly disease. Efficient. Home is one room shared with your parents, siblings, and 2 other families. Privacy doesn't exist when you're poor. The floor is dirt, walls drip with damp, and rags stuff the window to keep out cold. The Thames, London's enormous toilet, flows nearby. Today's Thames hosts boat tours. Victorian Thames hosted floating corpses and industrial waste. This wasn't just for the poorest few, this was millions of people. London exploded from 1 to 2.5 million residents in 50 years, like New York suddenly absorbing Chicago residents. Working folks lived in conditions that would make modern slum dwellers look privileged. Factories needed bodies, and bodies needed somewhere to sleep, quality optional. Your survival odds, 50%. Flip a coin. Heads, you see your first birthday. Tails, you don't. Victorian parents often didn't name babies for months. Today we decorate nurseries. Victorians prepared for funerals. If cholera doesn't get you, there's smallpox, scarlet fever, yada yada, whooping cough, or tuberculosis waiting in line. These diseases rampaged through poor areas. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. Victorian medicine gave you mercury, arsenic, or bleeding, treatments nearly as deadly as the diseases. Your diet, if you survive being weaned, bread soaked in water, maybe with animal fat if you're lucky. Milk came from sick cows kept in city barns and fed distillery waste, then watered down and mixed with chalk for that appealing white glow. Farm to table meant manure to mouth. Maternity leave didn't exist. Women went back to factories days after giving birth. If you're lucky, a sibling watches you. If not, you're dosed with Godfrey's cordial opium syrup that kept babies quiet while mum worked. Modern parents fret over screen time. Victorian parents drugged infants unconscious to earn enough for bread. Your housing actively tries to murder you. Cesspits leaking into drinking water. Sewage flowing in open street gutters. Landlords packed in families with no incentive to fix anything. When it rains, the damp rises. When it's dry, factory dust and coal smoke coat everything. London's pea super, fogs killed thousands in single events. Dr. Henry Julian Hunter described slum children as rickety and sickly looking beyond all description. Never had enough food or clothing, sleep huddled together in foul rooms. Victorian poverty didn't just mean hunger, it meant bones that grew bent. Rickets, the bone-bending vitamin D deficiency, was so common that twisted spines were normal. Narrow streets and tall buildings blocked what little sunlight penetrated London's smog. Coal smoke was so thick it turned day into night, creating permanent midnight in slum districts. Surviving to age 5 meant outliving half your playmates. Your reward? Time to earn money. Children today start school at 5. Victorian children started work. The concept of children needing protection was as foreign as the idea of giving voting rights to cats. Before official working age, you're put to use minding babies, running errands, collecting coal from railway tracks, or picking apart old rope until your fingers bleed. Childhood wasn't a protected time for development. It was job training for a life of exploitation. Alcoholism thrived when gin was safer than water. Child abuse wasn't just common, it was standard parenting. Spare the rod and spoil the child wasn't a saying, it was government policy. Victorian parents faced criticism for not hitting children hard enough. The slum you're born into marked you for life. Your accent, mannerisms, even your walk branded you as slum-born. Upper classes viewed you with disgust. Not a child, a threat, a future criminal, a problem requiring management. Parents who couldn't feed children sometimes abandoned them. Foundling hospitals existed, but had room for just a fraction of those in need. Your existence hinged entirely on your economic value. Even weather killed reliably. Winter in unheated slums meant frost on interior walls. Children froze to death regularly, their passing noted as exposure, a polite Victorian euphemism for left to die of cold. Children's bodies were often buried in unmarked graves, sometimes several to a coffin to save space and money. Those elaborate Victorian mourning rituals reserved for people who mattered, not slum children. All this happened while Britain reached unprecedented wealth. The empire claimed a quarter of the globe while children starved in the shadow of London palaces. The wealth gap wasn't just inequality, it was mass child sacrifice for economic growth. Abandonment was common. Parents who couldn't feed another mouth simply walked away. Today's social services take in neglected children. Victorian children had workhouses if they were lucky. Your existence depended entirely on your family's ability to keep you, a gamble in industrial Britain. Rural children fared no better. Country poverty had its own brutal flavor. Farm wages were lower than factory ones, housing just as bad, and options fewer. Modern rural poverty means limited access to services. Victorian rural poverty meant complete abandonment. Child death created a callousness incomprehensible today. Children's bodies were buried in unmarked graves, sometimes several to a coffin. Funerals were brief or non-existent for poor families. Those elaborate Victorian mourning rituals you see in museums, not for poor kids. They died unremarked and unmourned except by those who loved them. The cruelest part, these conditions existed alongside massive national wealth. The British Empire was at its peak, trade boomed, and the rich had fortunes that would embarrass Jeff Bezos. Children literally starved in the shadow of palaces. Today's wealth inequality means some kids get Nike shoes while others get Walmart brands. Victorian inequality meant some kids got feast while others got famine. So there's your entry into Victorian life. Born into filth, disease and neglect, with survival odds worse than modern-day bungee jumping with a frayed cord. And this is just the beginning. Surviving birth was just the beginning of your Victorian horror story. Now comes the real nightmare, discovering what it means to be property rather than person in a world that sees children as tools, not humans. To Victorians, who saw children's bodies as simply another commodity. 2, you were treated like a tiny adult with no rights. So, you've survived to age 5. Congratulations on beating odds that would make a professional gambler weep. Now prepare for your next shock. In Victorian England, the concept of childhood barely exists. You're not a developing person who needs protection and nurturing. You're a miniature adult with all the responsibilities, but none of the rights. The Victorians didn't invent the idea of children as small adults. This notion has ancient roots, but they perfected the art of exploiting it. The very concept of childhood as a distinct, protected phase of life was still emerging, championed by a few pioneering thinkers, but far from accepted by society at large. While wealthy children might enjoy some semblance of childhood, for the poor being young simply meant being a smaller, weaker worker who could be paid less. Your legal status is simple. Your property, not a person with inherent rights, a possession. Your father holds absolute power over you. He can hire you out, beat you, starve you, or lock you away. The law won't interfere unless he literally murders you, and even then, punishments were notoriously lenient. Fathers commonly got away with fatal abuse by claiming they were merely disciplining their children. The mother has virtually no legal rights to her children. If she leaves an abusive husband, he keeps the kids. They're his property, after all. Your legal status makes perfect sense to Victorians. After all, children aren't rational beings. They're primitive creatures needing strict control. This view was reinforced by Victorian Christianity, which emphasized original sin and the need to break a child's will through discipline. The popular Victorian parenting manual by Reverend John Abbott insisted that the first thing to be impressed upon a child is obedience, unconditional and immediate. Your feelings, needs and desires are irrelevant. Your job is to obey. This isn't just theoretical. Daily life hammers home your status. You're expected to show deference to all adults, not just parents. Any adult can correct you, discipline you, or report your behavior. Speaking when not spoken to is a punishable offense. Making eye contact with social superiors is impertinent. Having opinions is dangerous. Showing emotion is weak. You learn to be invisible, seen only when useful, heard never. Victorian adults are terrified of spoiling children. Praise is rare, affection is restrained, physical comfort is considered harmful to development. Cold baths, hard beds, and sparse meals build character, even for the wealthy. Children eat after adults, get the worst portions, and are often underfed deliberately to prevent gluttony. Modern parents worry about kids getting enough protein and vitamins. Victorian parents worried about kids getting enough hardship. Emotional needs? What are those? Victorian child psychology began and ended with the belief that children are inherently sinful and must have their spirits broken for their own good. Depression, anxiety, and trauma weren't recognized in children. Acting out was met with harsher discipline. Not understanding, the concept of developmental stages existed in early form but was ignored in practice. You're expected to act like an adult while being treated as an inferior being. Imagine being expected to show perfect adult self-control while having no adult rights or privileges. Your time is not your own, your body is not your own, your labor is not your own, even your thoughts must be properly controlled and regulated. The modern concept of letting children develop naturally would have horrified Victorians, who saw uncontrolled childhood as a direct path to criminality and moral corruption. Language and communication with adults follows strict rules. You speak when spoken to. You address adults with proper titles. You stand when adults enter the room. You use formal language even with parents. Breaking these rules brings swift punishment. While modern parents engage children in conversation, Victorian children were expected to be silent unless performing some required verbal task. The dinner table wasn't for family bonding, it was for learning proper manners and receiving lectures on moral conduct. For poor children, this adult-like status comes with adult-like work. By age 7 or 8, many children were working 12-hour days in factories, mines, or workshops. Even before that, you're put to work at home or in family businesses. While modern laws protect children from exploitation, Victorian laws protected businesses' right to exploit children. The 1833 Factory Act was considered radical for prohibiting factories from employing children under 9 and limiting children aged 9, 13 to a mere 48-hour work week. Progress. But it's not just poor children working adult hours. Wealthy children face their own version of adult expectations. Elite boys are sent to boarding schools as young as 7, where they're expected to endure brutal conditions without complaint. Physical abuse by masters, systemic bullying by older boys, terrible food and cold, damp housing are considered character building. Showing homesickness or distress marks you as weak and invites more abuse. Girls face relentless training in proper feminine behavior with posture boards, tight lacing, and endless lessons in submissive conduct. Recreation isn't for fun, it's training for adult social roles. Education, where available, isn't designed for children's developmental needs. It's adult education miniaturized. Memorization, recitation, and copying are the core methods. Subjects are taught without consideration for comprehension or relevance. Mistakes earn physical punishment. Questions are impertinent. Creativity is discouraged. Learning disabilities don't exist as a concept. You're simply stupid or stubborn, both fixed through beating. The rod isn't just a teaching tool. It's the primary teaching tool. The workhouse, that dreaded Victorian institution, perfectly embodies society's view of children as tiny adults. Children as young as 7 are separated from parents and put to the same grueling labor as adults. Their smaller bodies and developing minds are irrelevant. They receive the same harsh treatment, just smaller portions of the already inadequate food. Families entering workhouses are deliberately split up, with children seeing parents perhaps once a week, if at all. The psychological damage is immense and entirely disregarded. Justice systems make no meaningful distinction between children and adults. Children as young as 7 can stand trial and face the same punishments as adults, including transportation to penal colonies and execution, though the latter became less common for children after 1830. Prison conditions are identical for children and adults, with no separation by age. In 1850, over 12,000 children under 16 were imprisoned in England and Wales, many for trivial offences like stealing food or vagrancy. The infamous prison treadmill, a torture device disguised as hard labour, was used on children and adults alike. The legal definition of childhood shifted grudgingly throughout the Victorian era, but practical treatment lagged far behind. By the late Victorian period, children under 16 weren't supposed to be executed, but they could still be flogged, imprisoned with adults, or transported to colonies. The concept that children might need different treatment under the law was revolutionary and fiercely resisted by many who saw childhood crime as particularly dangerous to social order. Even your playtime, if you're lucky enough to have any, is training for adult roles. Boys play at war and work. Girls play at housekeeping and childcare. Toys are miniature adult tools. Playgrounds don't exist for most of the era. Games have moral lessons. Fun for its own sake is frivolous and dangerous. Imagination is discouraged as potentially leading to lies and moral weakness. When adults organize games for children, they're designed to instill proper values and social roles, not for enjoyment. Medical treatment fails to recognize children's different needs. Children receive the same brutal treatments as adults: bleeding, purging, blistering, and dosing with toxic substances. Anesthesia, when available, is often not used for children because their pain is considered less important or is viewed as beneficial in building character. Children's specific nutritional needs are unknown, and their psychological responses to trauma are ignored. A child who becomes withdrawn after abuse or loss is considered to be showing proper solemnity, not suffering damage. So there you are, a tiny adult with all the responsibilities of grown-up life, but none of the privileges, working adult hours, facing adult punishments, expected to show adult self-control, all while being treated as inherently inferior and denied any voice in your own fate. Your childhood isn't a protected time for development. It's a brutal apprenticeship in knowing your place. But surely there must be some silver lining? Perhaps the one advantage of being poor is that at least everyone has enough to eat. Oh, my sweet summer child. In Victorian England, you could quite literally starve to death while the wealthy dined on 10-course meals just streets away. And that's exactly where our journey takes us next, into the hungry world of Victorian food inequality, where some feasted while others faded away. 3. You could starve in front of a feast. You've survived birth in a slum. You've endured being treated like a miniature adult with none of the privileges. Now let's talk about your daily struggle for something most modern folks take for granted, not starving to death. Victorian England wasn't poor, quite the opposite. It was the wealthiest nation on earth, the workshop of the world, the center of a global empire spanning a quarter of the globe. London's ports bustled with ships bringing exotic goods from every corner of the planet. Their granaries overflowed with grain. Their markets heaved with produce. Their wealthy ate the most elaborate meals in human history, multi-course extravaganzas that lasted for hours. And yet, in the shadow of this abundance, children starved to death in the streets. This wasn't a natural disaster or temporary shortage. This was policy. This was structure. This was choice. The Victorian economy functioned on the principle that some people simply didn't deserve to eat, and children were at the bottom of the feeding chain. Let's start with what the wealthy ate, shall we? A typical upper-class Victorian dinner included multiple courses: soup, fish, meat, game, dessert, and savouries. Each course featured several dishes. The famous Victorian cookbook, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, included menu plans for dinner parties with over 30 different dishes. Special occasions might feature 50 or more. Meals lasted hours, with servants bringing endless processions of food that often went uneaten. Leftovers weren't given to the poor, they were thrown away. Feeding the hungry might encourage indolence after all. The wealthy didn't just eat different food. They ate different food in different rooms, prepared by different people, served on different dishes, with different utensils according to different rules. Food wasn't just nutrition, it was social performance. The elaborate etiquette surrounding Victorian upper-class dining wasn't just fussy, it was deliberately exclusionary, designed to identify those who belonged and those who didn't. One wrong fork choice could mark you as an imposter. You think modern social media creates status anxiety? Victorians turned dinner into competitive sport. Meanwhile, in the slums, your daily food looked rather different. Bread was the staple, the cheapest, coarsest bread available, often adulterated with chalk, alum or ground beans to stretch the flour. Tea, heavily watered down and reused multiple times. Perhaps a scrape of dripping animal fat or margarine if you were lucky. Fresh meat, rarely. Fresh meat, rarely. Fresh vegetables, almost never. Fruit, don't make me laugh. The gap wasn't just in quality but quantity. Poor children were perpetually hungry. Many families operated on the one meal a day principle, saving whatever food they could afford for an evening meal. Children went to school or work with empty stomachs, expected to function on nothing. The physical consequences were severe: stunted growth, weak bones, compromised immune systems. Victorian working-class men were, on average, 5 inches shorter than their upper-class counterparts. That's not genetics, that's malnutrition. Food adulteration wasn't just common, it was standard practice. Milk was watered down and whitened with chalk. Tea was mixed with used leaves and colored with copper. Bread contained all manner of non-food substances. Beer was laced with opium derivatives for a stronger effect. There were no food safety laws until late in the Victorian period, and even then, enforcement was spotty. The poor couldn't afford to be choosy. When you're starving, you don't ask what's in the sausage. Victorian attitudes toward hunger were shaped by the prevailing economic theory of Malthusianism, which held that feeding the poor adequately would only lead to them breeding more, creating more mouths to feed. Hunger was seen as a natural check on population growth among the undesirable classes. This wasn't fringe thinking, it was mainstream economic policy. When Ireland faced the Great Famine in the 1840s, many British officials saw it as unfortunate but necessary population control. Similar logic applied to domestic hunger. Starving children weren't a failure of the system, they were the system working as designed. The 1834 Poor Law cemented this approach, creating a relief system deliberately more unpleasant than the worst available jobs. The principle of less eligibility ensured that poor relief was so demeaning and inadequate that only the truly desperate would seek it. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was the explicit goal. Children's hunger was a tool to force parents into accepting any employment, no matter how dangerous or poorly paid. Even charity came with strings attached. Food assistance often required attendance at religious services or moral improvement lectures. Soup kitchens run by churches typically preceded their meager portions with lengthy sermons. Children had to prove they were deserving poor, typically by demonstrating appropriate gratitude, religious observance, and moral character. A child who grabbed food too eagerly might be denied future meals for showing greed. Hunger was seen not as a physical condition, but as a moral test. Street food existed, but was risky. Food vendors sold everything from hot eels to baked potatoes, often at prices even poor children could occasionally afford, but the quality was suspect at best. Food was prepared in unsanitary conditions, stored improperly, and often spoiled. Food poisoning was common, sometimes fatal. Still, for many children, these vendors provided the only hot food they ever tasted. Begging was criminalized under vagrancy laws. A starving child asking for food could be arrested, fined money they obviously didn't have, and imprisoned. Repeat offenders, even children, could be transported to penal colonies. The sight of hungry children was considered an unpleasant nuisance for the better classes, best removed from view rather than addressed. Rural hunger looked different, but was no less severe. Agricultural workers lived amid food production, but often couldn't afford to eat what they harvested. Poaching, taking game from a landowner's property, carried severe penalties, including transportation to penal colonies. Children caught stealing apples from orchards or vegetables from fields faced criminal charges. The game laws protected pheasants for aristocratic shooting parties, while children starved in villages nearby. The seasonal nature of hunger added another layer of misery. Winter was always the hungry time. Food prices rose as supplies dwindled. Heating costs increased, forcing families to choose between warmth and food. Work often decreased, especially in weather-dependent industries like construction. The cold increased caloric needs just as food became less available. Winter wasn't a time of cozy firesides for poor Victorian children. It was a desperate battle for survival on multiple fronts. School feeding programs didn't exist until the very end of the Victorian era. Children were expected to learn and work while hungry. Teachers reported students fainting in classrooms, unable to concentrate, or falling asleep from weakness. Some charitable schools offered meager meals, but these were the exception, not the rule. The idea that hungry children couldn't learn effectively was considered excusing poor moral character rather than acknowledging physical reality. Nutrition science barely existed, leaving even well-meaning adults ignorant about children's dietary needs. Victorian medical texts recommended restricting children's food to prevent gluttony and moral weakness. Growing children were often deliberately underfed based on these theories. Protein deficiency, vitamin deficiencies, and mineral deficiencies created a generation with compromised development. Rickets, scurvy, and pellagra were so common they weren't even considered diseases, just the natural state of poor children. The visible effects of childhood malnutrition were everywhere: stunted growth, rotten teeth, bent bones, sunken eyes, distended bellies. These weren't just aesthetic issues. They indicated serious, often permanent damage. A child who survives severe malnutrition carries the effects for life, with compromised immune systems, cognitive impairment, and reduced physical capacity. Victorian England created generations of permanently damaged humans through deliberate policy choices. Public eating carried strong class markers. Middle and upper class people never ate on the street. That was for the lower orders. A child eating in public was immediately identifiable as poor and therefore suspect. Police regularly moved along children eating in parks or public spaces, even if they had legitimately purchased the food. Public space wasn't for public use. It was for the respectable classes, and hungry children were decidedly not respectable. Food theft was among the most common crimes committed by children. Stealing a loaf of bread could result in transportation to Australia. Picking up a fallen apple from an orchard floor could mean imprisonment. The justice system made essentially no allowance for hunger as a motivation. Judges regularly lectured starving children on moral character while sentencing them to brutal punishments for food theft. Oliver Twist asking for more wasn't just fictional pathos, it reflected the criminalization of childhood hunger. Even water wasn't freely available. Clean water was a commodity, not a right. Public pumps existed, but were often contaminated. Water sellers charged for their services. The choice between spending precious pennies on water or food was daily reality. Many families used the same water for multiple purposes: washing, cooking, cleaning, because they couldn't afford more. Waterborne diseases like cholera resulted, creating a vicious cycle of illness and greater poverty. Food banks and soup kitchens existed, but were woefully inadequate. The prevailing Victorian belief was that hunger should be uncomfortable enough to motivate work. When charitable organizations attempted to provide more generous assistance, they faced fierce criticism for encouraging dependency. Even the most basic human need, food, was viewed through the lens of moral worthiness rather than physical necessity. Food became a marker of moral character. The ability to resist hunger, to function despite it, was praised as discipline and good training. Children who complained of hunger were seen as weak, greedy, or morally deficient. This wasn't just adult hypocrisy. It became internalized. Many Victorian memoirs from those who grew up poor mention the shame they felt at being hungry, as if their physical need was a moral failing. By the 1880s and 1890s, studies began documenting the extent of childhood malnutrition, revealing that as many as 30% of poor children in London showed signs of severe nutritional deficiency. These findings shocked some Victorians, but were dismissed by others as exaggeration or the natural consequence of poor heredity. The idea that society had a responsibility to feed children remained controversial even as the evidence of mass suffering became undeniable. So there you are, a hungry Victorian child. You watch carts of food roll by destined for wealthy tables. You smell cooking from restaurants you'll never enter. You see street vendors selling treats you can't afford. Your stomach aches constantly. Your growth is stunted. Your brain struggles to function. And society tells you this is your fault, a reflection of your moral inadequacy or your family's poor choices. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum. You've endured being treated as a tiny adult with all the responsibilities, but none of the rights. You've even managed not to starve to death, though hunger is your constant companion. Surely the worst is behind you. Oh, you precious innocent. In Victorian England, surviving one horror just meant you lived long enough to face the next. Because now it's time to enter the workforce, and that's where things get really ugly. Next up, part 4, where you'll discover the special hell that was child labor in Victorian England. Spoiler alert, it makes modern sweatshops look like luxury resorts. 4. You had to work until you collapsed. Congratulations! You've somehow survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult with no rights and perpetual hunger. Your reward? It's time to enter the workforce. And not the modern workforce with its annoying office politics and tedious meetings. The Victorian workforce, where dangerous working conditions might literally kill you today, and overtime meant until you physically collapse. The Victorian era coincided with the Industrial Revolution's massive expansion. Factories, mines, and workshops sprouted across Britain like toxic mushrooms. This economic miracle needed fuel, and the cheapest fuel available was children. Your small size, nimble fingers, and absolute powerlessness made you the perfect worker for many industrial tasks. The fact that these tasks might maim, stunt, or kill you was considered an unfortunate but acceptable business expense. Let's start with when you'd begin work. Modern kids worry about picking a career after university. Victorian children worried about surviving their first day of work at age 5 or 6, while various factory acts gradually pushed the official working age to 9 or 10 by mid-century. Enforcement was spotty at best. Many industries remained unregulated entirely. Parents desperate for income had every incentive to lie about a child's age, and employers had every incentive not to check too carefully. Your working hours would shock modern adults, let alone children. Early Victorian factories commonly operated 16-hour shifts. The 1833 Factory Act, considered radically protective at the time, limited children aged 9–13 to a mere 48-hour work week, 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Children over 13 could work 69 hours weekly. These limits applied only to textile factories. Other industries remained unregulated much longer. By comparison, modern children aren't allowed to work until age 14 in most countries, and then with strict limits on hours and conditions. The work environments defied description. Factories were unventilated, with air filled with lint, dust, or chemical fumes. Temperatures reached extremes. Textile mills were kept hot and humid to prevent threads from breaking, while other industries exposed children to freezing conditions. Lighting was poor, noise levels were deafening, and safety equipment was non-existent. Modern workplaces have ergonomic chairs and health and safety regulations. Victorian workplaces had ongoing industrial accidents and rampant occupational disease. Let's tour some popular Victorian child labor options, shall we? Textile mills were among the largest employers of children. As a little doffer, you'd replace full bobbins with empty ones on spinning machines. Simple enough, except the machines didn't stop for this process. Your small fingers worked inches from equipment that could catch a sleeve and pull in an entire arm before anyone could hit the stop switch, if the machine even had one. Shifts lasted 12–14 hours in deafening noise, choking dust, and sweltering heat. The machines ran continuously, so meals were eaten on the fly, often with cotton-coated fingers that ensured you ingested as much lint as food. If factory work sounds too cushy, perhaps mining is more your style. Children as young as 5 worked in coal mines, initially as trappers operating ventilation doors in the tunnels. Older children might become hurriers or drawers, hauling carts of coal through tunnels too small for adults. You'd wear a harness attached to the cart and crawl on hands and knees, often through water or mud, dragging loads that could exceed your own body weight. The 1842 Mines Act finally prohibited children under 10 and women from working underground, a reform considered shockingly radical at the time. The match industry deserves special mention for its unique brand of horror. Children dipped match heads in phosphorus, a chemical that caused phossy jaw, a gruesome condition where jawbones literally rotted away, starting with teeth falling out and progressing to facial disfigurement and brain damage. The symptoms might take years to appear, making cause and effect less obvious. Matchstick makers often had distinctive glowing faces in the dark from phosphorus absorbed into their systems. When their jaws eventually collapsed, they were simply replaced with fresh children. Chimney sweeping remains one of the most infamous Victorian child occupations. Small boys, some as young as 4, were sent up narrow chimneys to clean out soot deposits. Their masters often lit fires below to encourage faster movement if they got stuck. Burns, falls, suffocation, and cancer from constant soot exposure were common. The 1840 Chimney Sweeps Act prohibited anyone under 21 from climbing chimneys, but the law was largely ignored. Small sweeps were simply hidden when inspectors came around. Children continued climbing chimneys until the 1870s or later. Glassworks employed children to carry molten glass on rods from furnaces to workbenches. The ambient temperature often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and shifts lasted 12 hours or more. Burns were inevitable, eye damage common. Children worked barefoot on floors covered with broken glass because shoes wore out too quickly to be economical. Many developed severe respiratory problems from constant exposure to fumes and extreme temperature changes. The pottery industry created its own special hazards. Children dipped ceramics in glazes containing lead with no protective equipment. Lead poisoning caused irreversible neurological damage, kidney failure, and eventually death. The industry knew the dangers, but considered protective measures too expensive. Children's small hands were perfect for detail work, and their replacement cost when they became too sick to work was minimal. Street trades employed countless children with marginally better conditions, but less security. Crossing sweepers cleared paths through horse manure and mud for pedestrians. Flower sellers worked from dawn until their stock was gone. Messengers ran deliveries across dangerous city streets. These children were technically self-employed, meaning no labor laws protected them. Income was unpredictable, work was weather-dependent, and competition was fierce. The upside was relative freedom. The downside was even greater precarity than factory work. Climbing boys, not just chimney sweeps, cleaned various industrial spaces too small for adults. Brick kilns, bakery ovens, and industrial flues all needed regular cleaning, and children were the perfect disposable tool for the job. The fact that these spaces were often still hot, filled with toxic residue, or dangerously unstable, was simply an occupational hazard. When accidents happened, they were typically reported as unfortunate but unavoidable, rather than the predictable consequence of using children for inherently dangerous work. Domestic service employed huge numbers of children, particularly girls. While less immediately dangerous than industrial work, it had its own horrors. Working days could stretch to 18 hours, beginning before dawn and ending long after the household retired. Abuse was common and almost impossible to report or escape. Sexual exploitation was rampant. A servant girl had no recourse against predatory employers or their sons. Physical punishment for minor infractions was standard. And unlike factory workers, domestic servants lived with their employers, providing no separation between work and rest. Farm work might sound idyllic compared to factories or mines, but agricultural labor was brutally hard and dangerous. Children scattered seed, harvested crops, and tended animals in all weather conditions. Farm machinery had no safety features and regularly claimed limbs. Pesticides, including arsenic compounds, were applied by hand without protection. Shifts followed daylight from sunrise to sunset, which meant 16-plus-hour days in summer. And agricultural work was exempt from most early labor regulations, leaving farm children unprotected long after factory children gained some minimal safeguards. The garment industry's sweating system employed children in home-based workshops making clothing. Working from dawn until late night, they hand-stitched garments in dim light, causing irreversible eye damage. Crowded conditions spread tuberculosis and other diseases. Payment was by piece, creating intense pressure to work faster and longer. The scattered nature of this work made it nearly impossible to regulate, allowing exploitation to continue long after factory conditions began to improve. Brickfields used children to carry heavy clay and finished bricks. Working in all weather, these children typically developed spinal deformities from carrying excessive weights while their bones were still forming. Summer work in full sun caused heat stroke. Winter work in freezing mud caused frostbite. Clay dust damaged lungs permanently. The seasonal nature of the work meant intense exploitation during production months, followed by unemployment and starvation during off-seasons. Matchbox making, artificial flower assembly, and similar piecework were brought home by entire families, with children as young as 3 expected to contribute. Working in cramped tenements by candlelight, children glued, folded, and assembled for up to 16 hours daily. Payment rates were deliberately set so low that only by employing the entire family from dawn to midnight could a living wage be earned. This homework remained entirely unregulated throughout the Victorian period. Let's talk about payment. Modern minimum wage laws ensure even entry-level workers receive legal minimums. Victorian child workers received whatever employers decided, often a fraction of adult wages for identical work. Boys typically earned more than girls for the same tasks. Payment was sometimes withheld for minor infractions or simply because the employer felt like it. There was no recourse for wage theft. Some children weren't paid in money at all, but in food or lodging of substandard quality, creating a system of debt bondage that was slavery in all but name. Apprenticeships deserve special mention for their particular brand of exploitation. Originally designed as legitimate training systems by Victorian times, many apprenticeships were simply legal fictions, allowing employers to obtain child labor at even lower costs. Orphans and workhouse children were particularly vulnerable, being apprenticed to masters who provided minimal training and maximum exploitation. These children had no parent to check on their treatment or advocate for them. Many apprentices never learned the promised trade, but were used as general laborers until they became too large or old, then discarded. The physical effects of child labor were immediately visible and permanently damaging. Children developed characteristic deformities based on their occupation. Mill workers often had flattened fingers or missing digits from machinery accidents. Miners developed curved spines and bowed legs. Chimney sweeps had twisted limbs, burns, and respiratory damage. Matchmakers had deteriorating jawbones. These weren't rare industrial accidents. They were expected occupational outcomes so common they created physically distinct worker populations, identifiable by their specific deformities. Occupational diseases created another layer of suffering. Respiratory ailments plagued children in dusty trades, from textile work to mining. Chemical exposure caused skin conditions, neurological damage, and organ failure. Extreme temperatures led to circulatory problems. Constant standing created varicose veins and joint issues in children as young as 10. These conditions weren't recognized as occupational diseases, but attributed to poor constitution or moral failings. When children became too sick to work, they were simply replaced. Working conditions included more than physical environment. Discipline was brutal and physical. Children were beaten for working too slowly, making mistakes, falling asleep despite 14-hour shifts, or simply to motivate faster work. Fines reduced already meager wages. Humiliations like being hung in a basket above the work floor or forced to wear degrading signs were common motivational techniques. Some industries used strapping, where children were struck with leather straps for minor infractions or to increase productivity. The psychological impact of child labor was equally devastating. Children developed hypervigilance and anxiety disorders from working in constantly dangerous conditions where a moment's inattention could mean disfigurement or death. The complete absence of autonomy or control created learned helplessness. Exposure to adult workplaces meant early exposure to all manner of vices and abuses. Working children rarely had time to play or develop normally, creating adults with profound social and psychological deficits that further limited their prospects. Education became legally required, only gradually throughout the Victorian period, and enforcement remained spotty. The Factory Acts eventually mandated part-time education for working children, but these half-time schools provided minimal instruction to exhausted children who often fell asleep at their desks after hours of heavy labor. Many employers falsified attendance records or operated token schools that provided no actual education. Children who worked outside regulated industries often received no education at all, creating generational illiteracy that further limited escape from poverty. The 1833 Factory Act limited textile factory children aged 13 to 8-hour days and required 2 hours of education daily. The 1842 Mines Act banned underground work for children under 10 and women. The 1847 10-Hour Act capped working days for women and young persons 13 sate in textile factories. The 1864 Factory Acts Extension Act expanded regulations to more industries. The 1874 Factory Act raised minimum working age to 10 and improved education requirements. Each was considered radical when passed, yet each still permitted exploitation that today would constitute criminal child abuse. What makes this history particularly damning is that Victorian Britain wasn't using child labor out of economic necessity. It was the wealthiest nation on earth, with unprecedented industrial output and global trade dominance. Child labor wasn't required for economic survival. It was employed because it maximized already substantial profits. Children worked not because the nation needed their labor, but because employers preferred their cheapness, vulnerability, and replaceability. The defense of child labor revealed Victorian society's profound moral bankruptcy regarding its youngest members. Politicians argued that poor children were naturally different from wealthy ones, physically suited to labor, intellectually limited, and morally at risk without the discipline of exhausting work. The same politicians who sent their own children to elite schools argued that education would make working-class children dissatisfied with their proper station. The hypocrisy was as breathtaking as it was transparent. So there you are, a Victorian child worker. Your body is permanently damaged before puberty. Your growth is stunted from overwork and malnutrition. Your education is minimal or non-existent. Your prospects for improvement are virtually zero. You face daily pain, constant danger, and complete powerlessness. And society tells you this is your natural and proper place in the world. But surely, if you manage to be a perfect, obedient worker, your boss would treat you with basic human decency. Oh, my sweet summer child. In Victorian England, your employer could do virtually anything they wanted to you, with zero consequences. And that's exactly where our journey takes us next, into the heart of unchecked power and exploitation that defined the relationship between Victorian children and those who employed them. 5. Your boss could do whatever they wanted to you. You've endured birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like a miniature adult with no rights, constant hunger despite living in a wealthy nation, and back-breaking labor that permanently damaged your body. But hold on to your threadbare cap, because we haven't yet explored the special relationship between Victorian child workers and their employers, a relationship with all the warmth and fairness of a crocodile dining with a duckling. In Victorian England, your employer wasn't just your boss, they were your lord, your master, your absolute ruler. The power imbalance between employers and child workers wasn't just profound, it was practically unlimited, enshrined in law, custom, and economic reality. While modern employment involves contracts, rights, limitations, and recourse for mistreatment, Victorian child employment operated on the principle that employers owned their workers in all but name. Let's start with hiring practices. Modern employment involves applications, interviews, and mutual agreement. Victorian child employment often involved literal purchase. Workhouse children were apprenticed to employers who paid the parish a fee, after which the child became their property for all practical purposes. Orphans were distributed to whoever would take them. Even when parents arranged employment, they typically received a lump sum payment that effectively sold their child's labor for years to come. Children had no say in where or how they worked. Physical punishment wasn't just permitted, it was expected as proper management. Employers used canes, straps, and whips as routine disciplinary tools. Children were beaten for working too slowly, making mistakes, falling asleep despite exhaustion, or simply because the employer was in a foul mood. These weren't occasional slaps, but systematic beatings that left lasting injuries. When children died from such discipline, courts typically ruled it unfortunate, but within the master's rights. The 1851 law technically limited reasonable correction, but left that entirely to employers' interpretation. Safety measures cost money, and money spent on safety reduced profits. Victorian employers typically opted for profits. Machines ran unguarded, toxic chemicals were handled with bare hands, and structural hazards went unaddressed until catastrophic failures caused mass casualties. When children were injured or killed in entirely preventable accidents, employers faced no penalties. Injured children received no compensation and were simply replaced with fresh bodies. The concept of employer liability for workplace injuries barely existed. Payment often came in forms other than cash, all designed to further exploit children. Truck payment systems paid workers in tokens redeemable only at company stores, which charged inflated prices for substandard goods. Some children received room and board instead of wages, with room being a corner of a workshop floor and board being barely edible scraps. Others were paid in damaged goods from the factories where they worked, which they then had to sell to convert to actual money. Hours weren't just long but unpredictable. Children might be sent home without pay during slow periods, then forced to work through the night when orders increased. This unpredictability made it impossible to arrange education, rest, or any semblance of normal life. Employers could demand immediate overtime with no notice and no extra pay. Refusing meant dismissal. During busy seasons, children might work 20+ hours straight, with catastrophic accidents occurring when they inevitably succumbed to exhaustion. The hiring fairs, or mop fairs, where many rural children were contracted out to farmers, deserve special mention for their dehumanizing practices. Children were displayed like livestock, with potential employers physically examining them for strength and health before bidding on their labor. Once hired farm children often lived in outbuildings with animals and worked from dawn to dusk, completely at the mercy of farmers who faced no oversight or inspection. Rural isolation meant no witnesses to abuse. Health consequences of working conditions were the child's problem, not the employer's. When cotton dust destroyed lungs, phosphorus dissolved jawbones, or lead glazes caused neurological damage, employers expressed regret at the unfortunate natural phenomena that had nothing to do with their business practices. Industry owners actively fought against scientific research linking specific industries to specific health conditions. When such links became irrefutable, they argued that protective measures were too costly or that workers knew the risks, including, apparently, 5-year-olds. Transportation to colonial industries represented a particularly egregious abuse of power. Poor children, especially from workhouses, were shipped to colonies like Australia, Canada, and South Africa to work in industries requiring cheap labor. Once there, they were entirely at the mercy of colonial employers, with no oversight and no way to return home regardless of conditions. Many disappeared into colonial exploitation systems, their fates unrecorded. This practice continued well into the late Victorian period under the euphemism of child migration programs. Employers controlled not just working conditions but behavior, speech, and even thoughts. Children could be dismissed for insolence, which might mean nothing more than a facial expression the employer disliked. Political opinions, religious views, or cultural practices that employers found objectionable were grounds for dismissal. Some factories and workshops required specific clothing, hairstyles, or speech patterns as conditions of employment. Children's bodies were not their own, but resources to be managed according to employer preferences. The character reference system created another layer of control. Future employment depended entirely on references from previous employers. A child who complained about conditions, refused unpaid overtime, or otherwise displeased an employer would receive no reference, making them unemployable elsewhere. This created a system where workers were forced to accept any treatment, however abusive, or risk permanent unemployment. The mere threat of a bad reference was enough to enforce compliance with even the most outrageous demands. Housing was often tied to employment, especially in industrial towns with company-owned accommodations. Children living in these settings faced eviction if they lost their jobs, creating homelessness on top of unemployment. In remote industrial settlements, company housing might be the only option available, making workers entirely dependent on employers for both income and shelter. This created closed systems where employers controlled every aspect of workers' lives, from working hours to living conditions to where they could shop. Employers didn't just control children's present, but their future. Without education or skill development beyond the specific repetitive tasks they performed, child workers became adults with no prospects for advancement or escape. Some industries deliberately prevented children from learning broader skills, keeping them trapped in low-wage positions for life. The children who cleaned machines were carefully prevented from learning to operate them. The children who carried materials were kept ignorant of fabrication techniques. Keeping workers unskilled kept them cheap and replaceable. The reform movement faced its fiercest opposition from employers, who argued that any restriction on their treatment of child workers constituted an intolerable government intrusion into business and a threat to Britain's industrial dominance. When health inspections, age restrictions, and hours limitations were proposed, industry representatives predicted economic collapse. These same representatives lived in luxurious homes built on profits extracted from children's suffering. The hypocrisy was as breathtaking as it was transparent. Even religious institutions, which might have been expected to advocate for humane treatment, often reinforced employer power. Many church leaders preached that submission to earthly masters was divine will, and that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. When reform-minded clergy did speak out against child exploitation, they frequently faced backlash from wealthy parishioners who happened to own the factories and mines being criticized. Spiritual comfort came with strings attached to the same economic power structure. The legal system offered almost no protection. While assault was technically illegal, courts routinely dismissed cases of child worker abuse as legitimate discipline. Police were reluctant to intervene in what they considered private business matters. Judges often had financial interests in the same industries where exploitation occurred. The few laws restricting the worst abuses were weakly enforced, with paltry penalties that employers considered a minor cost of doing business. A factory owner might pay a £5 fine for violations that earned thousands in profit. Factory inspectors existed in limited numbers, but faced overwhelming obstacles. In 1838, there were just 4 inspectors for all of Britain's tens of thousands of factories. Employers received advance notice of inspections, temporarily improving conditions or hiding underage workers. Inspectors could be bribed or intimidated. Children who spoke truthfully to inspectors faced dismissal once the inspector left. The inspection system was designed to create the appearance of oversight without meaningful enforcement. What makes this systematic exploitation particularly damning is that it occurred during Britain's period of greatest prosperity. The Victorian era saw unprecedented wealth creation, with Britain controlling a quarter of the world's economy. This wasn't desperate exploitation out of national necessity, but calculated abuse to maximize already substantial profits. Child workers weren't necessary for economic survival. They were convenient tools for increasing profit margins. The moral justifications for this exploitation reveal Victorian society's profound ethical bankruptcy regarding its youngest and most vulnerable members. Children of the poor were described as a different breed from their wealthy counterparts, physically suited to labor, intellectually limited, and morally at risk without the discipline of exhausting work. This convenient biological fantasy allowed the comfortable classes to ignore suffering that would have been considered intolerable for their own children. The few employers who attempted humane treatment faced economic disadvantage against competitors with fewer scruples. The system actively punished decency and rewarded exploitation. Without universal standards enforced by law, the worst employers set the competitive baseline that others had to meet or exceed. This race to the bottom in human terms was presented as the inevitable working of economic natural law rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize profit over children's lives. By the late Victorian period, reform movements gained momentum, gradually improving the legal standing of child workers. The Factory Acts established minimum working ages and maximum hours. The Education Acts mandated at least basic schooling. The Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act criminalized some forms of exploitation, but these improvements came too late for generations of children whose bodies and futures had already been sacrificed to industrial progress and private profit. So there you are, a Victorian child worker completely at the mercy of your employer. Your body, your time, your health, and your future are resources to be extracted for someone else's benefit. You have no legal protection, no practical recourse, and no escape options. Your employer's power over you is nearly absolute, and society tells you this arrangement is not just economically necessary, but morally beneficial for someone of your class. Oh, you precious innocent. In Victorian England, even the institutions ostensibly designed to help children were nightmares in disguise, because when work exploitation wasn't enough, there was always systematic physical abuse masquerading as discipline, and that's where our journey takes us next. 6. You were beaten for everything. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like a miniature adult with no rights, perpetual hunger in a land of plenty, backbreaking labor that permanently damaged your body, and the absolute power your employer held over your existence. But we've yet to explore one of the most defining experiences of Victorian childhood: systematic physical violence masquerading as discipline and moral education. In Victorian England, beating children wasn't just common, the rod wasn't spared, and children certainly weren't spoiled. Violence against children wasn't a regrettable necessity or a last resort. It was the cornerstone of child rearing, education, and institutional care. This wasn't occasional disciplinary spanking, but systematic, severe corporal punishment designed to break children's spirits and ensure unquestioning obedience. Let's start with home life. Victorian parenting manuals explicitly recommended regular beating as essential to moral development. Popular guides, like those by Sarah Stickney Ellis, advised parents that physical pain is the natural consequence of wrongdoing and should be applied early and often. The evangelical movement particularly emphasized the need to break the will of children who were considered inherently sinful and requiring physical correction to develop moral character. Not beating your child was considered neglectful parenting. Instruments of domestic discipline weren't just hands but purpose-designed tools. The cane, riding crop, leather strap, and birch rod were standard household implements. Some Victorian homes had dedicated punishment rooms where beatings were administered. Children as young as 2 were subject to formal whippings for infractions, as minor as crying too loudly, speaking without permission, or showing willfulness, which could mean nothing more than having an opinion. These weren't rare, extreme cases, but standard parenting practice in respectable homes. School discipline elevated corporal punishment to an art form. The cane was the primary educational tool in Victorian classrooms, used not just for behavioral infractions but for academic mistakes. Get your sums wrong, canting, Misremember a Latin declension, canting, handwriting too messy, canting. Schools kept detailed punishment books recording the number of strokes administered to each child, with some students receiving multiple beatings daily. Public schools, which, confusingly, were actually exclusive private schools, were particularly brutal, with older students often given authority to beat younger ones, creating cycles of institutionalized abuse. Workhouse discipline was notoriously severe. Children in these institutions faced beatings for infractions as minor as speaking during meals, having dirty hands, despite working in inherently dirty conditions, or not completing impossible work quotas. Workhouse masters had nearly unlimited authority, with little oversight or accountability. When investigations did occur, they were typically prompted by deaths or severe injuries that couldn't be hidden, not by the routine violence that was considered normal and necessary. Reformatories and industrial schools, institutions for wayward children or minor offenders, operated on the principle that harsh physical discipline was the only way to create moral improvement. Children in these institutions faced flogging for infractions as minor as speaking during silent periods, failing to complete work quotas, or showing insufficient gratitude for their rescue from the streets. Some institutions used formal punishment parades where children witnessed beatings of peers as deterrents. Others employed systematic humiliation alongside physical pain, forcing children to wear signs detailing their offenses or stand in stress positions for hours. Orphanages and children's homes varied in their approaches, but physical discipline was universal. Even the more progressive institutions considered corporal punishment essential to proper child rearing. Children were routinely beaten for bedwetting, often caused by stress or poor nutrition, looking insolent, which might mean making eye contact with an adult, or failing to master skills they'd never been properly taught. The institutions considered kindest still employed physical punishment that would constitute criminal assault by modern standards. Prison discipline for children was identical to that for adults, with the added element that children's smaller bodies suffered more severe damage from the same treatments. The prison treadmill, a torture device disguised as hard labor, was used on children as young as 8. Children who couldn't keep pace on these devices were beaten while still on the treadmill, sometimes falling and sustaining serious injuries. Prison floggings were administered with implements designed to maximize pain, including the infamous cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-tailed whip that shredded skin and caused permanent scarring. Even medical treatment incorporated beating as therapy. Various nervous conditions in children, which might include perfectly normal childhood behaviors or responses to trauma, were treated with percussion therapy, ritualized beating designed to shock the nervous system back to proper function. Children with developmental disabilities, learning differences, or trauma responses were routinely beaten for behaviors they couldn't control. The line between punishment and treatment was non-existent in many Victorian institutions. Public humiliation typically accompanied physical punishment. Children were beaten in front of peers, siblings, or entire institutions. Some schools had dedicated platforms where canting was performed before the assembled student body. Workhouses conducted public punishments as deterrents. Even home discipline often involved beating children in front of siblings or servants to maximize the shame associated with the physical pain. This psychological dimension was considered as important as the physical suffering in creating properly submissive children. The language used to justify this systematic abuse reveals much about Victorian attitudes toward children. Beating was described as character formation, moral education, or breaking natural stubbornness. Children who showed spirit or resistance were diagnosed with moral insanity, requiring aggressive correction. The concept of a child's natural development was replaced with the idea that children were proto-adults whose negative qualities required literal beating out of them. Pain wasn't an unfortunate side effect of discipline, but its primary mechanism. Gendered approaches to beating created distinct experiences for boys and girls. Boys typically received more severe physical punishment with the explicit goal of toughening them for a harsh world. Girls received somewhat lighter physical correction, but faced more psychological humiliation with the goal of creating properly submissive women. Both approaches were designed to prepare children for their predetermined social roles, not to develop their individual potential or well-being. The physical consequences of this systematic violence were severe and lasting. Victorian medical journals documented cases of children suffering broken bones, internal injuries, and even death from disciplinary beatings. More common were chronic pain, scarring, and musculoskeletal problems that persisted into adulthood. Children beaten regularly for bedwetting often developed urinary tract problems that lasted a lifetime. The medical profession largely ignored these consequences or attributed them to children's inherent weakness rather than questioning the practice of beating itself. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Children developed what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses, including hypervigilance, anxiety disorders, depression, and dissociative conditions. Victorian literature contains countless descriptions of children becoming good through having their spirits broken, a process we would now recognize as traumatic submission, not moral improvement. Many victims internalized the belief that they deserved abuse, creating cycles of self-hatred and self-destruction that persisted long after the beatings ended. Social class created stark differences in physical punishment experiences. Upper-class children faced formalized, ritualized beatings in elite boarding schools, painful and humiliating but generally within defined limits. Middle-class children typically experienced regular domestic discipline with designated implements. Working-class children faced not only household beatings but workplace discipline, institutional punishment if they entered the welfare system, and judicial corporal punishment if they ran afoul of the law. The poorer the child, the more bodies had legal authority to beat them. Even the reformers who advocated for better treatment of children often stopped short of condemning corporal punishment entirely. The most progressive Victorian child welfare advocates typically argued for moderation in beating children, not its elimination. The NSPC, National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, founded in 1884, initially focused on preventing extreme abuse that caused permanent injury or death, not routine physical discipline. The idea that children should never be beaten was considered radical well into the 20th century. The legal system provided almost no protection. Parents and institutional authorities had explicit legal right to use reasonable physical correction, with reasonable defined extremely broadly. When children did die from beatings, courts typically attributed their deaths to underlying health conditions that made them unusually susceptible to punishment, rather than questioning the punishment itself. Coroners frequently ruled that children had died from natural causes, despite clear evidence of severe physical trauma. What makes this systematic violence particularly damning is that it occurred alongside emerging scientific understanding of child development. By the mid-Victorian period, progressive physicians and psychologists were beginning to document the harm caused by severe physical punishment. This evidence was largely ignored or dismissed as sentimentality by those with vested interest in maintaining authoritarian control over children. The science was available, society chose to disregard it. The justifications for this abuse were deeply hypocritical. The same society that claimed beating was necessary for proper moral development simultaneously described the working classes, who had all been beaten as children under this system, as inherently immoral and dangerous. If beating created good character, why did its most beaten members continue to require correction? This contradiction was rarely addressed. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning as designed, not to improve children, but to break them into submission to authority. By the late Victorian period, attitudes began slowly shifting. The 1880s saw the first serious challenges to unlimited physical discipline of children, with early child protection laws establishing extreme boundaries beyond which beating became legally recognized as abuse. The 1889 Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act made it possible to remove children from parents who injured them severely. Though routine beating remained perfectly legal, schools gradually reduced the range of offenses punishable by caning, though the practice itself continued well into the 20th century. So there you are, a Victorian child for whom physical pain is a daily reality. At home, at school, at work, in institutions, at every point where you interact with adult authority, your body is subject to deliberate infliction of pain as training. Your physical autonomy doesn't exist. Your pain is considered morally beneficial, and society tells you this systematic violence is for your own good, necessary to shape you into a proper Victorian citizen. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum. You've endured being treated as a tiny adult with all the responsibilities, but none of the rights. In this era, even schools were instruments of torture, disguised as benevolent institutions. And that's where our journey takes us next. Into the nightmarish reality of Victorian education, where learning took a distinct backseat to suffering. 7. School was rare and horrifying. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like a miniature adult with no rights, perpetual hunger in a land of plenty, backbreaking labor that permanently damaged your body, absolute employer power, and systematic physical violence, masquerading as discipline. Now let's explore Victorian education, a system that, for those lucky few who accessed it, managed to combine intellectual deprivation with physical and psychological torture. First, let's address availability. Modern children in developed nations take universal education for granted. Victorian children had no such luxury until the 1870 Education Act. Schooling was entirely voluntary and mostly private. The 1870 law established board schools for children without access to existing schools, but didn't make attendance compulsory until 1880. And even then, enforcement was spotty. Working-class children, particularly in industrial areas, often received no formal education at all. By 1870, only about half of working-class children attended any form of school, and attendance might mean a few sporadic weeks between work seasons. For the poorest children, education came in the form of ragged schools, charitable institutions for destitute children who couldn't afford even the minimal fees of other schools. These operated in whatever spaces could be found: damp cellars, abandoned buildings, church vestries. Facilities were abysmal, with children often sitting on floors or broken furniture. Teachers were usually untrained volunteers. Educational materials were whatever could be begged or borrowed, and the curriculum focused primarily on basic literacy and religious instruction. Physical conditions in these schools were often actively hazardous, with poor ventilation, inadequate heating, and structural dangers. Dame schools represented the next step up. Small informal schools run by women, often elderly and with minimal education themselves, who taught basic reading and perhaps simple arithmetic. These operated in private homes, with children crowded into single rooms, often sharing precious few books and writing materials. Quality varied wildly, with some providing decent basic education and others serving primarily as childcare, where little learning occurred. Many dame school teachers were simply women too old or infirm for other work, who needed income and had no particular aptitude for teaching. Board schools, established after 1870, provided basic education for working-class children who couldn't access church schools or private education. Facilities improved on ragged schools but remained grim by modern standards. Classes of 60 IT students were common, with a single teacher managing through strict discipline rather than educational methodology. Buildings were utilitarian at best, with poor lighting, inadequate heating, and minimal ventilation. Many early board schools had no playgrounds, regarding physical activity as unnecessary for working-class children whose future involved physical labor. Church schools, run by various religious denominations, educated many working-class children. These emphasized religious instruction alongside basic academic subjects, with denominational doctrine forming a substantial portion of the curriculum. Anglican schools were typically more established, while Catholic schools often served the poorest, frequently Irish immigrant communities. Education quality varied widely, but religious conformity was universally enforced through physical discipline. Children from families of different faiths had little choice but to absorb whatever religious instruction was offered or face punishment. For middle-class boys, grammar schools provided more extensive education, but with similarly brutal methods. These schools emphasized classical education, Latin, Greek, mathematics, with minimal attention to practical subjects. Discipline was harsh, with regular caning for academic mistakes and behavioral infractions. The curriculum remained largely unchanged since medieval times, with little relevance to industrial Victorian society. Rote memorization was the primary teaching methodology, with understanding considered far less important than perfect recitation. Middle-class girls typically attended small private schools, emphasizing accomplishments rather than academic subjects. Music, drawing, basic French and deportment took precedence over mathematics or sciences. The goal wasn't intellectual development, but creating marriageable young women who could manage households and display appropriate social graces. Even girls with academic aptitude were discouraged from unfeminine intellectual pursuits. The message was clear: a woman's mind was a secondary consideration at best, a dangerous liability at worst. Upper-class boys attended public schools, which, confusingly, were actually elite private institutions like Eton, Harrow, and Rugby. These schools were infamous for systemic brutality, with younger boys essentially enslaved to older ones in the fagging system. Physical conditions were deliberately harsh, with inadequate heating, poor food, and crowded dormitories considered character building. Academic instruction focused almost exclusively on classics, with modern subjects like science or contemporary languages considered inferior. The true purpose wasn't education but socialization into the ruling class, creating networks and instilling attitudes that maintained social hierarchy. Upper-class girls rarely received formal schooling until the very late Victorian period. Governesses provided home education, focusing primarily on social accomplishments and moral instruction rather than academic subjects. Even wealthy girls were often deliberately kept ignorant of subjects considered unsuitable for females, including most sciences, advanced mathematics, classics, and any topic related to politics or business. The goal was producing decorative, obedient wives for upper-class men, not educated individuals in their own right. Now let's discuss what happened inside these educational establishments. The physical environment alone would violate every modern health and safety regulation. Classrooms were overcrowded, with children packed onto backless benches or forms. Lighting was poor, usually insufficient natural light, supplemented by expensive candles or oil lamps used sparingly. Heating was minimal, with children in winter often suffering chilblains and frostbite. Ventilation was considered unnecessary or actively harmful, based on miasma theories about disease. Children sat for hours in airless rooms breathing each other's illnesses. Sanitation deserves special mention for its particular horrors. Many schools had only outdoor privies, often insufficient for student numbers and poorly maintained. Some had no facilities at all, expecting children to wait until they returned home. Hand-washing facilities were minimal or non-existent. In residential schools, bathing might be weekly at most, in shared water that grew increasingly filthy. These conditions created perfect breeding grounds for disease, with epidemics regularly sweeping through schools and sometimes killing significant portions of the student body. The curriculum emphasized rote learning over understanding. Children memorized facts, passages, and processes without necessarily comprehending them. Questioning was discouraged as impertinent. Independent thinking was considered dangerous. The famous Victorian schoolmaster Thomas Arnold explicitly stated that first religious and moral principles, Second, gentlemanly conduct. Third, intellectual ability was the proper order of educational priorities. Actual knowledge acquisition ranked last, well below conformity training. Teaching methods were uniformly dreadful by modern standards. The monitorial system, popular in many schools for poor children, had older students teaching younger ones by rote, with a single adult overseeing hundreds of children. This wasn't motivated by pedagogical theory, but by cost saving. One teacher's salary could cover an entire school. Quality was predictably abysmal, with child monitors having barely mastered the material themselves. The blind literally led the blind through educational darkness. Physical discipline wasn't incidental to Victorian education, but central to its methodology. The cane was considered the primary teaching tool. Children were beaten for academic mistakes, missing school often due to required work or family emergencies, asking questions, showing insufficient deference, or simply being selected as examples to maintain class discipline. School punishment books meticulously recorded the number of strokes administered to each child, with some students receiving multiple beatings daily. This wasn't considered abuse, but proper educational practice. Learning disabilities received no accommodation or recognition. Children with dyslexia were beaten for carelessness or stubbornness when they struggled with reading. Those with attention difficulties were punished for willful inattention. Physical disabilities often received minimal accommodation. Partially deaf children were punished for not hearing instructions. Visually impaired students were beaten for poor handwriting. These weren't occasional failures of compassion, but systematic approaches, reflecting the belief that disabilities reflected moral rather than physical conditions. The content of education varied dramatically by class and gender, creating and reinforcing social stratification. Working-class children received minimal academic instruction focused on literacy, basic numeracy, and religious instruction. Essentially, just enough education to make them useful workers while emphasizing obedience and acceptance of their social position. Middle-class boys learned classics and mathematics, preparing them for professional careers. Middle-class girls learned domestic skills and social accomplishments for marriage markets. Upper-class boys received education designed for government and empire. Upper-class girls learned to be ornamental hostesses. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed to reproduce existing social hierarchy. For working-class children who managed to attend school at all, education competed with work requirements. The half-time system allowed children to work part-time while attending school part-time, in theory, providing both income and education. In practice, children arrived at school exhausted from work shifts, often falling asleep at desks and learning little. Teachers in half-time schools reported attempting to teach children who were physically incapable of focusing after 8 hours of factory labor. The system acknowledged the need for education while ensuring working-class children couldn't meaningfully access its benefits. Religious instruction dominated curriculum across all school types, with denominational doctrine presented as absolute truth requiring memorization rather than understanding. Children from different faith backgrounds had no accommodation and faced punishment for questioning religious teaching or failing to participate in worship. Jewish children in Christian schools faced particular challenges, sometimes forced to participate in Christian prayers or punished for observing their own religious practices. This wasn't considered religious persecution, but proper moral education. The physical health consequences of Victorian schooling were severe and lasting. Poor ventilation and overcrowding spread infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, which remained the leading killer of school-aged children. Inadequate heating led to chilblains, respiratory infections, and sometimes frostbite. Poor lighting caused eye strain and vision problems. Uncomfortable seating created posture problems and spinal deformities. Extended immobility during long school days contributed to physical underdevelopment. The schools themselves were frequently as dangerous to children's health as the worst industrial workplaces. the psychological impact was equally devastating. Children developed what we would now recognize as school phobia, anxiety disorders, and trauma responses to educational settings. Victorian literature contains countless descriptions of children dreading school with physical symptoms of fear, not laziness or dislike of learning, but genuine terror of institutional abuse. Many developed learned helplessness, concluding that survival required absolute submission rather than engagement or achievement. The system wasn't designed to nurture minds, but to break spirits. Teachers themselves often had minimal qualifications. Until late in the Victorian period, no formal teacher training existed for many school types. Pupil teachers, children as young as 13 appointed to teach younger pupils while receiving some instruction themselves, were common in schools for the poor. Their own education was often rudimentary, leaving them ill-equipped to teach others. Many adult teachers, particularly in dame schools and rural areas, had only basic literacy themselves. The idea that teaching required special skills or aptitude was considered unnecessary sentimentality. The physical isolation of teachers in single classroom settings created perfect environments for abuse to flourish, unchecked. Many schools operated with one teacher per classroom with no oversight or accountability. Children who reported mistreatment were rarely believed over adult authority figures. School managers and inspectors focused on academic results and discipline, not student welfare. Teachers, who maintained quiet, orderly classrooms through terror, were considered exemplary regardless of actual educational outcomes. For the poorest children, even this inadequate education remained largely inaccessible. School fees, though modest by middle-class standards, presented an insurmountable barrier for families struggling to feed themselves. Even free schools required supplies, acceptable clothing, and most critically, the child's time away from wage earning. When education finally became compulsory in 1880, many poor families faced impossible choices between legal compliance and economic survival. Truancy officers became feared figures in poor communities, representing not educational opportunity, but legal persecution. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began improving educational access and quality, but changes came slowly and unevenly. The 1870 Education Act established board schools to fill gaps in existing provision. The 1880 Act made attendance compulsory for children aged 5–10. The 1891 Elementary Education Act eliminated fees for most elementary education. Each represented progress, but faced resistance from those with vested interests in maintaining class distinctions through educational limitation. Even these reforms left many children receiving education that emphasized obedience over learning. So, there you are, a Victorian child attempting to access education against overwhelming odds. If you're poor, you're probably not in school at all, or attending sporadically between work shifts. If you do attend, you're in an overcrowded, unhealthy environment where beatings are the primary teaching tool, and the curriculum is designed to keep you in your predetermined social place. If you're lucky enough to be middle class, you're receiving more extensive education, but still within a system of ritualized violence and intellectual constraint. And society tells you this is the best possible preparation for your future. In Victorian England, family bonds were as fragile as everything else in a child's life, because when poverty struck hard enough, you could literally be sold or given away by the very people meant to protect you. And that's where our journey takes us next. 8. You could be sold or given away. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult with no rights, perpetual hunger, back-breaking labor, absolute employer power, systematic violence, and educational deprivation. But we haven't yet explored one of the most devastating realities of Victorian childhood, the shocking fragility of family bonds. Because in Victorian England, children weren't just metaphorically disposable, they could literally be disposed of when they became inconvenient or unaffordable. Modern society generally views the parent-child relationship as sacred and permanent. Victorian society viewed it as conditional and transferable. Children weren't individuals with inherent rights to family connection, but economic assets or liabilities whose value determined whether they were kept or discarded. This wasn't a rare extreme occurrence, but a systematic approach to child distribution based on economic utility rather than emotional bonds. Let's start with the most direct practice: child selling. While not technically legal, the sale of children occurred with surprising frequency and openness in Victorian England. Newspaper archives contain matter-of-fact reports of children being sold in marketplaces alongside livestock and produce. A typical price for a healthy child ranged from a few shillings to a few pounds, less than the cost of a decent cow. These weren't black market transactions conducted in shadows but open exchanges, often with witnesses who considered the practice distasteful but not particularly shocking. Who bought children? Various parties with different motives. Factory owners purchased children directly from impoverished parents, paying a lump sum that provided temporary financial relief to families while securing years of cheap labor. Childless couples sometimes bought children as informal adoptions, particularly infants, with transactions handled without legal oversight or follow-up. Chimney sweep masters, entertainment promoters, and other employers of child labor regularly acquired children through direct purchase, considering the price good value for years of profit from the child's work. Baby farming represented a particularly horrific variation on child selling. Unwed mothers or destitute families would pay a small fee to baby farmers who promised to find good homes for unwanted children. In reality, many of these operations were systematic infanticide enterprises. The infamous Amelia Dyer, executed in 1896, is believed to have murdered hundreds of infants placed in her care. She collected fees from mothers, then promptly killed the babies and disposed of their bodies. When finally caught, authorities were less shocked by her actions than by the scale of her operation. Similar baby farms operated throughout the Victorian period, with occasional prosecutions when mortality became too obvious to ignore. Informal adoptions occurred regularly, with children transferred between families without legal process or oversight. These arrangements ranged from genuinely benevolent relatives taking in orphaned kin to nakedly exploitative. Children were frequently adopted as unpaid domestic servants, farm laborers, or workshop assistants. Without legal protections or monitoring, these children were entirely at the mercy of their new families. Abuse, neglect, and exploitation were common, with no recourse available to the transferred child. The workhouse system facilitated another form of child disposal. Destitute families could surrender children to workhouses, ostensibly temporarily, until their fortunes improved. In practice, many never reclaimed their children, who became parish children, available for apprenticeship or service placement. Workhouse authorities actively encouraged this abandonment by separating families upon entry, making parental visits difficult or impossible, and creating administrative barriers to family reunification. The message was clear: poverty meant surrendering not just material comfort, but the right to parent your own children. The apprenticeship system served as a legally sanctioned method of transferring parental rights. Children as young as 7 could be apprenticed to masters who gained complete control over them until adulthood. The original concept of apprenticeship involved teaching skilled trades, but by Victorian times, many apprenticeships were thinly disguised transfers of cheap labor with minimal training component. Parish apprentices, workhouse children had no choice in their placement and no advocate to ensure their proper treatment. Families desperate for the premium payment from master to parent might apprentice children to notoriously abusive trades like chimney sweeping. Child migration schemes represented mass disposal of unwanted children. Organizations like Dr. Barnardo's and the Children's Friends Society shipped thousands of poor British children to colonies, including Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Marketed as providing better opportunities for the children and meeting colonial labor needs, these programs frequently resulted in severe abuse and exploitation. Children as young as 4 were sent alone on ships to distant countries, then distributed to colonial farmers and businesses seeking cheap labor. Many disappeared into remote areas with no oversight or monitoring. Parental consent was often obtained through deception or coercion, if sought at all. The legal framework governing children treated them essentially as property. Until the late Victorian period, fathers had nearly absolute rights over their children, including the right to transfer those rights to others. Mothers had almost no legal standing regarding their children, even when fathers were abusive or negligent. Children themselves had no legal voice in their disposition. The law recognized the father's right to allocate his children's labor or presence, however he saw fit, including permanent transfer to others. Only in extreme cases of abuse, resulting in death or severe injury, did the law intervene in these parental rights. Economic desperation drove most child transfers. When Victorian families faced crises like parental death, unemployment, illness, or homelessness, children were often the first assets liquidated. A contemporary observer noted that poor families typically sacrificed children in predictable order. First, daughters were sent into domestic service, then younger children to whoever would take them, keeping older sons longest due to their greater earning potential. This wasn't seen as cruel but practical. Fewer mouths to feed increased survival chances for remaining family members. The sexual exploitation market created particularly high demand for young girls. While officially condemned, prostitution of minors was widespread and visible in Victorian cities. Girls as young as 12 were sold to brothels by parents, relatives, or guardians who had acquired them through informal transfers. The standard defloration fee for virgins created direct market value for young girls, who could be sold for considerable sums to brothels catering to wealthy clients with specific tastes. This trafficking occurred openly enough that reformers like W.T. Stead could document it in newspaper exposés without difficulty in finding cases. Religious organizations facilitated substantial child transfers, sometimes with benevolent intent, but often with troubling results. Church-run orphanages and children's homes collected children from unsuitable parents, a category that conveniently included the poor, the unmarried, and those of different faiths. Once acquired, children were frequently shipped to colonial outposts or distributed to approved families, with biological parents given minimal information about their fate. Religious conversion was often an explicit goal, particularly for Catholic or Jewish children placed with Protestant organizations. The fostering system operated without regulation or oversight. Families could informally foster children for payment, creating situations ripe for abuse. Unlike modern foster care with its regulations and monitoring, Victorian fostering operated as private business transactions. Some foster parents provided genuine care. Others saw children as pure financial opportunities, minimizing expenses on the children's maintenance while collecting fees from parents or authorities. Children who died in foster care rarely prompted investigation unless circumstances were extraordinarily suspicious. Industrial schools and reformatories served as another disposal method for difficult children. Parents could voluntarily commit children to these institutions, effectively transferring guardianship to the state. Once admitted, children had no right to leave until adulthood and often had minimal contact with families. While ostensibly educational facilities, many operated as thinly disguised labor camps where children worked long hours in institutional laundries, farms, or workshops. Parents who later attempted to reclaim children often discovered that legal barriers or geographical distance made reunification nearly impossible. The language used to describe these practices reveals much about Victorian attitudes toward children. References to superfluous children, excess population, and redundant offspring appear in official documents and charitable publications. Organizations facilitating child transfers marketed themselves as reducing the burden of children on struggling families while providing human resources to industries and colonies needing workers. Children themselves were discussed in terms of their economic utility rather than their emotional needs or inherent value as humans. What makes these practices particularly damning is that they operated alongside Victorian rhetoric about the sanctity of family and the importance of proper child-rearing. The same society that wrote sentimental poetry about innocent children and maternal love created systematic mechanisms for breaking family bonds whenever economic considerations demanded. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as class-based application of different standards. Family sanctity applied to the middle and upper classes, while economic utility governed working-class family relationships. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began establishing some protections against the worst abuses. The 1889 Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act created the first significant legal acknowledgement that children had rights separate from parental property interests. Adoption remained unregulated until the 20th century, however, and many questionable child transfer practices continued under different labels. Even dedicated reformers often focused on improving conditions within transfer systems rather than questioning the fundamental premise that children could be redistributed based on economic factors. The psychological impact of these practices created generational trauma that Victorian society neither recognized nor addressed. Children separated from families experienced what we would now identify as attachment disorders, abandonment trauma, and identity crises. Without modern understanding of psychological development, these responses were interpreted as behavioral problems or moral failings requiring harsher discipline rather than emotional support. Children displaying grief or anger at family separation were punished for ingratitude toward those who had rescued them from poverty. Perhaps most disturbing is how these practices reflected and reinforced the commodification of children across Victorian society. When children could be bought, sold, transferred, and disposed of based on market values, it became easier to justify their exploitation in factories, mines, and workshops. The interchangeability of children as economic units, the idea that any child could replace any other for work purposes, created a society where individual children's suffering became statistical rather than personal. One broken child could always be replaced with another. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the Victorian era. Children shipped to colonies often lost all connection to their origins, creating generations with fractured identities and unknown heritage. Families, broken apart, rarely reunited, with siblings sometimes living their entire lives without knowing of each other's existence. Records were poorly kept or deliberately destroyed, making later attempts to reconnect biological families nearly impossible. The last child migrants were sent from Britain to Australia as late as the 1970s, showing how persistent these practices remained. So there you are, a Victorian child whose place in your family depends entirely on your economic value. If you're healthy and old enough to work, you might be kept for your wage contribution. If you're too young, too many, too female, or too expensive to maintain, you might be sold to the highest bidder, surrendered to institutions, shipped to colonies, or simply given to whoever will take you. Your emotional bonds, personal needs, and individual identity are irrelevant compared to your utility as an economic unit. And society tells you this is simply the natural order of things. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum. You've endured being treated as a tiny adult with none of the rights. You've managed not to starve despite perpetual hunger. You've suffered through back-breaking labor that permanently damaged your body. You've survived the absolute power employers held over your existence. You've even endured systematic violence and educational deprivation. You've somehow avoided being sold or given away by your family. Surely your suffering must be nearly complete. Oh, you sweet summer child. In Victorian England, even being homeless wasn't just a misfortune, it was a crime. and the legal system stood ready to punish children for the crime of having nowhere to go. That's where our journey takes us next. 9. You could be jailed for being homeless. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult without rights, perpetual hunger, backbreaking labor, absolute employer power, systematic violence, educational deprivation, and the constant risk of being sold or given away. But we've yet to explore one of the most Kafkaesque aspects of Victorian childhood, the criminalization of poverty itself. Because in Victorian England, having nowhere to live wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment. The Victorian approach to homeless children wasn't to shelter them but to jail them. The 1824 Vagrancy Act, which remained in force throughout the Victorian period and beyond, made it a criminal offense to be found wandering abroad without visible means of support or a fixed abode. This deliberately vague wording gave police broad authority to arrest anyone who appeared to be homeless, including children as young as 7, the age of criminal responsibility in Victorian Britain. The crime wasn't anything these children had done, it was what they were, homeless and poor. When we say children were jailed for homelessness, we don't mean they were placed in specialized juvenile facilities with child-appropriate treatment. Victorian children were imprisoned in adult jails, alongside hardened criminals of all types. No separation by age existed in most prisons until late in the Victorian period. A homeless 10-year-old might share a cell with adult thieves, violent offenders, or sexual predators. Prison officials considered this appropriate. Criminal contagion was thought to have already occurred by virtue of the child's vagrancy. If they weren't corrupted before imprisonment, they certainly would be after. The conditions in Victorian prisons defied description. Overcrowding was standard, with cells designed for 1 or 2 inmates, often holding 5 or more. Sanitation was minimal or non-existent, with a single bucket serving as a toilet for multiple prisoners. This bucket might be emptied only once daily, filling cells with the stench of human waste. Ventilation was poor, disease rampant. Prison epidemics regularly killed significant portions of the inmate population, with children particularly vulnerable due to their already compromised health from street life. The punitive regime inside prisons deliberately maximized suffering. The silent system, used in many Victorian prisons, prohibited inmates from speaking to each other at any time. Children caught whispering faced additional punishments like reduced rations or solitary confinement. The separate system isolated prisoners completely, sometimes for years, creating profound psychological damage. Children subjected to extended isolation often developed what we would now recognize as psychosis. These weren't bugs in the system but features. Prison was designed to be so terrible that it deterred choosing homelessness. Hard labor formed the core of prison sentences, even for children imprisoned for vagrancy. The treadwheel, essentially a giant hamster wheel that prisoners had to keep moving through sheer body weight, was standard in many prisons. Children worked the same treadwheels as adults, despite their smaller bodies making the labor proportionally more difficult. The crank required prisoners to turn a heavy handle thousands of times daily, producing nothing but exhaustion. Oakum picking, unraveling old ropes until fingers bled, was assigned when other hard labor wasn't available. These weren't productive activities but deliberate torture disguised as work. Food in Victorian prisons was calculated to provide bare survival calories while maximizing discomfort. The diet consisted primarily of watery gruel, coarse bread, and occasionally small portions of tough meat. Children received the same rations as adults. Despite different nutritional needs, the food was deliberately made unappetizing, not just through poor quality ingredients, but through preparation methods designed to create disgust. The message was clear: prison was not meant to sustain life comfortably, but to punish every aspect of existence, including the basic need for nourishment. The sentence for first-time vagrancy might be relatively short, perhaps a week or month, but the experience typically ensured recidivism rather than rehabilitation. Children released from prison had nowhere to go, no support system, and now carried the stigma of imprisonment. Their only realistic option was returning to the streets, where they would inevitably be arrested again for the same offense of having nowhere to live. Each subsequent arrest typically brought longer sentences, creating a cycle that could consume entire childhoods. For repeat offenders, including children, arrested multiple times for homelessness, sentences escalated dramatically. Third or fourth vagrancy offenses could result in years of imprisonment or transportation to penal colonies. Victorian court records contain numerous cases of children as young as 10 being sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia for the crime of being repeatedly homeless. This wasn't considered excessive, but appropriate escalation for incorrigible vagrants who had failed to learn from previous punishments. The court process itself was a farce for homeless children. With no money for legal representation and no understanding of their rights, such as they were, children typically faced summary justice in police courts. Hearings lasted minutes, with magistrates processing dozens of cases hourly. Children had no opportunity to present defenses or explanations. Their appearance alone, dirty, poorly clothed, obviously street-dwelling, was considered sufficient evidence of vagrancy. Sentencing followed immediately, with children taken directly to prison from the courtroom. Alternative welfare institutions were often worse than prisons. Reformatories and industrial schools, ostensibly created to provide alternatives to imprisonment for juvenile offenders, operated regimes that combined the worst aspects of prisons and workhouses. Children sentenced to these institutions faced years of confinement, with minimal education and maximum exploitation of their labor. Physical punishment was routine and often severe. These weren't humanitarian alternatives to imprisonment, but different versions of the same punitive approach to child poverty. What's particularly damning about this criminalization of child homelessness is that Victorian society actively created the conditions it then punished. Economic policies that kept wages below subsistence level, housing policies that allowed slum landlords to evict families arbitrarily, and poor laws that separated families in workhouses all directly contributed to child homelessness. The society that made homeless children then punished them for the condition it had created, presenting their suffering as a moral failing rather than a predictable consequence of economic structure. Police quotas and incentives encouraged active targeting of homeless children. Officers were evaluated partly on arrest numbers, making vulnerable street children ideal targets. Unlike adult criminals who might resist arrest or have social connections to report police misconduct, homeless children were perfect victims, visible, defenseless, and voiceless. Many police divisions conducted regular sweeps of areas where homeless children congregated, filling arrest quotas with easy targets who had committed no crime beyond existing without shelter. The portrayal of vagrancy laws as public protection rather than poor persecution represented Victorian hypocrisy at its most transparent. Official justifications claimed that removing idle children from streets protected public health and morals while benefiting the children themselves through discipline and structure. The reality that imprisonment created physical and psychological damage while doing nothing to address the causes of homelessness was obvious but ignored. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning exactly as designed to criminalize poverty while absolving society of responsibility for creating it. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Children developed what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses, including attachment disorders, hypervigilance, and dissociative conditions. The deliberate humiliation built into the prison system, head shaving, uniform clothing, physical inspection, enforced silence, created profound shame and damaged self-concept. Many developed learned helplessness, concluding that no matter what they did, society would always criminalize their existence. The system wasn't designed to reform, but to break spirits and enforce submission. Religious organizations that intervened with homeless children often imposed conditions as punitive as the legal system. Salvation came with strict behavioral and religious requirements. Children had to demonstrate proper gratitude, religious conversion, and complete submission to authority. Those who questioned religious instruction or failed to display appropriate piety faced rejection and returned to the streets, an inevitable imprisonment. Genuine charity without strings attached was rare, with most rescue efforts focusing more on moral reformation than addressing material needs. Certain categories of homeless children faced even harsher treatment. Those identified as having mental disabilities or developmental differences were often transferred from prisons to asylums, where conditions were frequently worse and release even less likely. Children of Irish immigrants or other marginalized ethnic groups received longer sentences for identical circumstances compared to native English children. Those suspected of sexual activity, regardless of whether it was voluntary or coerced, faced particularly severe moral condemnation and punitive treatment. The few genuine reform efforts faced fierce resistance from systems invested in criminalizing child poverty. Thomas Barnardo, despite problematic aspects of his approach, at least recognized that homeless children needed housing rather than imprisonment. His establishment of homes for street children represented a radical departure from punitive approaches, though still wrapped in Victorian moral frameworks and evangelical goals. Even these imperfect alternatives were attacked by authorities and competing religious organizations, with Barnardo facing numerous lawsuits for housing children without proper parental or parish authorization. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began challenging the criminalization of child homelessness, though progress came slowly. The 1908 Children Act finally established separate juvenile courts and detention centers, acknowledging that children should not be processed through adult criminal systems. However, the fundamental approach of criminalizing homelessness itself remained largely unchanged. Children continued to be arrested and institutionalized for the crime of having nowhere to live well into the 20th century. What makes this criminalization of homeless children particularly damning is that it occurred alongside performative Victorian concern for child welfare. The same society that imprisoned children for being homeless produced sentimental literature about the sacred innocence of childhood and the special duty adults held toward young people. This wasn't simple hypocrisy, but class-based application of different standards. Childhood innocence was for middle and upper-class children, while working-class children were viewed as morally corrupt by nature and requiring punitive control rather than protection. So, there you are, a Victorian child with nowhere to live. Perhaps your parents died, your family was evicted, or economic disaster forced you onto the streets. Your very existence is now criminal. Police hunt you, courts condemn you, and prisons await to punish you for the offense of being young and homeless. Your suffering isn't considered a social failure requiring remedy, but a moral failing requiring correction through punishment. And society tells you this is justice. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum. You've endured being treated as a tiny adult with none of the rights. You've managed not to starve despite perpetual hunger. You've suffered through back-breaking labor that permanently damaged your body. You've survived the absolute power employers held over your existence. You've endured systematic violence and educational deprivation. You've avoided being sold or given away by your family. You've even escaped imprisonment for the crime of having nowhere to live. Surely now society would offer some form of assistance. 10. The workhouse was a death sentence. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult without rights, perpetual hunger, back-breaking labor, absolute employer power, systematic violence, educational deprivation, the risk of being sold or given away, and criminalization of homelessness. But we've yet to explore what many Victorian children considered the ultimate horror, the workhouse, that notorious institution where the poorest of the poor was sent when all other options failed. The Victorian workhouse wasn't a welfare program in any modern sense. It was a deliberate deterrent designed to be so horrific that people would choose virtually any alternative, no matter how desperate. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which established the workhouse system, explicitly operated on the principle of less eligibility, meaning conditions inside workhouses must be worse than the worst conditions available outside them. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but the core design principle: workhouses weren't failing when they created suffering. They were functioning exactly as intended. For children, the workhouse experience began with family separation. Upon entering, families were immediately split. Men, women, and children sent to different sections with no communication allowed between them. Siblings were further separated by gender and sometimes by age. Children as young as 2 were taken from their mothers. This separation wasn't due to space constraints or administrative convenience, but deliberate policy to break family bonds and enhance the deterrent effect. The message was clear: seek public assistance and lose your family. The physical conditions defied description. Overcrowding was standard, with dormitories packed so tightly that beds touched. Ventilation was poor, sanitation inadequate. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with workhouse epidemics regularly killing significant portions of the population. Workhouse fever, typhus, and ophthalmia, eye infections leading to blindness, was so common in these institutions, they were named for them. Medical care, when available, was minimal and often administered by untrained staff or more capable inmates. The daily regime was designed to maximize discomfort and reinforce powerlessness. Days began before dawn with immediate bed making to exact specifications. Any wrinkle or imperfection brought punishment. Mandatory chapel services followed, regardless of personal faith. Work occupied most waking hours, with brief breaks for inadequate meals. Lights out came early, with absolute silence enforced overnight. This schedule operated 365 days a year. No weekends, no holidays, no respite from the grinding routine designed to break spirits. For workhouse children, education existed in name only. While the 1834 Poor Law technically required 3 hours of daily schooling for workhouse children, implementation ranged from inadequate to non-existent. Workhouse schools were typically run by older inmates with no teaching qualifications or dedicated teachers paid minimal salaries. The curriculum focused primarily on religious instruction and industrial training, preparing children for manual labor rather than academic subjects. Many workhouse children remained functionally illiterate despite years of education. Work requirements applied to all inmates, regardless of age. Children as young as 7 performed labor appropriate to their size and strength. Oakum picking, unraveling old ropes until fingers bled, stone breaking, sewing, laundry work, or food preparation. This wasn't occupational training, but deliberately monotonous tasks designed to be unpleasant and mindless. The work produced minimal economic value. Its primary purpose was punishment and deterrence rather than productivity. Discipline was harsh and physical. Children faced beatings for infractions as minor as speaking during meals, working too slowly, or failing to show proper deference to workhouse staff. Punishments included reduced rations from an already inadequate diet, solitary confinement in unheated cells, or formal flogging. Workhouse masters had nearly unlimited disciplinary authority, with minimal oversight. Abuses rarely came to light unless they resulted in death or severe injury that couldn't be concealed. Medical experimentation represented another layer of exploitation. Workhouse children were frequently used as test subjects for new treatments or surgical techniques. Consent was considered unnecessary for pauper children who were viewed as state property once they entered the workhouse system. Experimental vaccines, surgical procedures, and treatments were tested on workhouse children before being used on paying patients. Medical schools often had arrangements with local workhouses to provide child subjects for demonstration surgeries and anatomical study. The apprenticeship system functioned as officially sanctioned child trafficking. Workhouse authorities had legal power to apprentice children as young as 7 to any master willing to take them, with or without the child's or parents' consent. These parish apprentices received no payment beyond basic maintenance and had no legal right to leave their positions regardless of treatment. Many were sent to notoriously dangerous trades like chimney sweeping or mining, where their small size made them valuable but vulnerable. Death or serious injury of parish apprentices rarely prompted investigation. Death rates in workhouses far exceeded the general population, with child mortality particularly high. Official inquests typically attributed deaths to pre-existing conditions rather than workhouse conditions. When investigations did occur, they were generally conducted by local worthies with personal or professional relationships to workhouse administrators. Records were often falsified to conceal systematic neglect or abuse. The dead received pauper burials in unmarked graves, their passing noted with the same bureaucratic indifference that characterized their treatment in life. The language used to describe workhouse inmates reveals much about Victorian attitudes toward the poor. Official documents referred to inmates or paupers rather than residents or people. Children born in workhouses were classified as bastards in official records regardless of their parents' marital status. Workhouse administrators described their charges in annual reports in terms that emphasized moral failings rather than economic circumstances. The poor weren't seen as people experiencing hardship, but as a separate, morally deficient class whose suffering was deserved and necessary. What makes the workhouse system particularly damning is that it operated during Britain's period of greatest wealth and global power. The nation that controlled a quarter of the world's land mass and economy chose to warehouse its poorest citizens in conditions of deliberate cruelty while presenting this as charitable assistance. The workhouse wasn't an unfortunate necessity during economic crisis, but a deliberate policy choice made by the wealthiest society on earth. The contrast between imperial splendor and workhouse squalor revealed Victorian moral bankruptcy in its starkest form. Religious organizations, which might have been expected to advocate for humane treatment, often reinforced workhouse ideology. Many denominations operated within the framework that poverty reflected moral failing rather than economic structure. Religious services in workhouses emphasized submission to divine will, conveniently aligned with submission to workhouse authorities. The biblical passage, "If any would not work, neither should he eat," was frequently invoked to justify inadequate food for those deemed insufficiently productive, including children too young or weak to meet work quotas. The few voices advocating reform faced fierce resistance from systems invested in punitive approaches to poverty. Charles Dickens' portrayal of workhouse conditions in Oliver Twist was criticized not for inaccuracy, but for excessive sentimentality toward the poor. When real-world investigations revealed conditions paralleling or exceeding Dickens' fictional accounts, authorities typically responded with minimal cosmetic changes while maintaining the fundamental punitive structure. The system wasn't broken but functioning as designed to punish poverty while presenting this punishment as charity. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began challenging workhouse conditions, though progress came slowly. The 1891 Custody of Children Act gave parents right of appeal against workhouse authorities' decisions about their children, though practical barriers made this right largely theoretical for the poorest families. Various workhouse visiting societies attempted to improve conditions through external oversight, with limited success against entrenched institutional resistance. True reform would require dismantling the entire conceptual framework of punitive poor relief, a task that extended well beyond the Victorian period. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of workhouse life for children was the complete absence of joy or comfort. No toys, no celebrations, no affection, no praise, no beauty, no music, no stories, no play. Childhood itself was effectively criminalized, with normal developmental needs for stimulation, movement, and emotional connection treated as disciplinary issues requiring correction. The system wasn't just materially depriving children, but actively preventing normal psychological and social development. Workhouse children weren't just hungry and cold, but emotionally starved in ways that created lifelong damage. The legacy of the workhouse system extended far beyond the Victorian era. Children who survived these institutions often carried psychological scars throughout their lives, passing trauma responses to subsequent generations. The stigma of workhouse birth followed people throughout their lives, limiting social and economic opportunities long after they left the institutions. Records of workhouse residents created permanent black marks on employment prospects. The system was designed not just to punish current poverty, but to ensure its continuation across generations by limiting opportunity and breaking family bonds. So there you are, a Victorian child in the workhouse, separated from family, inadequately fed, poorly clothed, forced to work, harshly disciplined, educationally neglected, medically experimented upon, and psychologically broken. Your very existence is processed as a bureaucratic problem requiring management rather than a human life deserving support. Your suffering isn't an unfortunate side effect of poverty relief, but the core design feature of a system meant to deter others by making examples of children like you. And society tells you this punishment is actually charity, for which you should show gratitude. In Victorian England, mental or physical differences weren't seen as medical conditions requiring support, but moral failings requiring isolation. And that's where our journey takes us next, into the horrifying world of Victorian asylums, where children with differences were imprisoned for the crime of being different. 11. You could be put in an asylum just for being different. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult without rights, perpetual hunger, back-breaking labor, absolute employer power, systematic violence, educational deprivation, the risk of being sold or given away, criminalization of homelessness, and the horrors of the workhouse. But we've yet to explore one of the most terrifying aspects of Victorian childhood, the ease with which children who were different could be locked away in asylums, often for life, with no hope of release or appeal. In Victorian England, mental institutions weren't medical facilities in any modern sense, but warehouses for those society found inconvenient, disturbing, or simply different. Children with developmental disabilities, learning differences, physical impairments, behavioral issues, or even just personalities that didn't conform to rigid Victorian norms risked indefinite confinement in conditions that ranged from neglectful to actively abusive. This wasn't rare or exceptional. It was standard practice, supported by law, medicine, and social custom. Let's start with the diagnostic criteria, which by modern standards were not just unscientific, but actively ridiculous. Victorian psychiatry, or alienism, as it was then called, classified an astonishing range of normal childhood behaviors as mental disorders requiring institutional treatment. Masturbatory insanity could get a child committed for normal sexual development, or even simple self-soothing behaviors. Moral insanity covered essentially any defiance of authority or social norms. Children with epilepsy were routinely institutionalized as epileptic idiots, regardless of their cognitive abilities. The diagnostic net was cast so wide that virtually any child could be deemed institutionalizable under the right circumstances. The commitment process offered almost no procedural protections. A single physician's signature could condemn a child to indefinite confinement with no requirement for second opinions, objective evidence, or even examination in many cases. Parents from wealthy families could commit difficult children on flimsy pretexts, inconvenient daughters who rejected arranged marriages, sons who showed insufficient academic aptitude, children whose behavior threatened family reputation. For poor families, authorities could initiate commitment proceedings without parental consent based on reports from teachers, employers, or local officials about abnormal behavior. The physical conditions in Victorian asylums defied description. Overcrowding was standard, with patients frequently sleeping on floors when beds were unavailable. Sanitation was minimal, with inadequate toilet facilities and infrequent bathing opportunities. Ventilation was poor, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Heating was often inadequate, with patients suffering hypothermia during winter months. Food was minimal and poor quality, served communally with little accommodation for individual needs. These weren't temporary arrangements, but standard operating conditions in institutions meant to warehouse the abnormal for life. Treatment methods were closer to torture than therapy. Restraint was the primary management technique, with children tied to beds or chairs for hours or days for behaviors as minor as crying or talking too loudly. Straitjackets, manacles, and restraint chairs were standard equipment in children's wards. Cold water treatment, essentially prolonged partial drowning, was used for excitement or non-compliance. Spinning chairs were used until children vomited or lost consciousness, supposedly to rebalance nervous systems. These weren't exceptional punishments but routine medical treatments administered by staff who genuinely believed in their therapeutic value. The water cure deserves special mention for its particular horrors. Children were subjected to high-pressure hoses, forced immersion in ice water, and water dropped on their heads from height for hours, all supposedly to shock their systems back to normal function. These treatments caused hypothermia, near-drowning experiences, and profound psychological trauma. Children's terror was interpreted as the treatment working properly by breaking through to their underlying condition. Resistance only proved the need for more aggressive intervention. Isolation was standard practice, with children placed in barren seclusion rooms for behaviors as minor as crying for parents or refusing medication. These rooms typically contained nothing but a drain in the floor for bodily waste. Children might spend days or weeks in isolation with minimal human contact beyond staff delivering inadequate meals. This sensory and social deprivation caused profound psychological damage, creating or exacerbating the very behaviors the isolation was supposedly addressing. The resulting deterioration was interpreted not as treatment failure, but as confirmation of the child's inherent abnormality. Physical discipline went far beyond what even Victorian schools or homes considered acceptable. Children were beaten for behaviors they couldn't control, seizures interpreted as willful disruption, autistic stimming viewed as deliberate provocation, developmental disabilities seen as moral failings requiring correction. Unlike other institutions where beating served clear punitive purposes, asylum violence was framed as therapeutic, breaking resistance to create compliant patients. The line between treatment and punishment was non-existent, with medical justifications providing cover for systematic abuse. Medical experimentation added another layer of exploitation. Asylum patients, considered legally incompetent, could not refuse participation in experimental treatments. New drugs, surgical techniques, and therapeutic approaches were tested on institutionalized children before being used on paying patients. Psychosurgery, including early versions of lobotomy, was performed on children with minimal evidence of efficacy or safety. There was no concept of informed consent. Children's bodies were viewed as legitimate research materials once they entered institutional care. The educational deprivation was total and deliberate. Most asylums provided no education whatsoever for children classified as idiots or imbeciles, terms applied to a wide range of cognitive and developmental differences. The prevailing view was that such children were ineducable, and any attempt at instruction wasted resources. Even those with mild learning differences or normal intelligence, misdiagnosed due to behavioral issues, typically received minimal education focused on compliance rather than development. Children who entered asylums with reading or mathematical abilities often lost these skills through disuse in unstimulating environments. The classification system itself ensured permanent institutionalization, Victorian psychiatry recognized conditions like idiocy and imbecility as inherently incurable, making discharge planning irrelevant. Once labeled with these conditions, children entered a one-way system designed for containment rather than rehabilitation. Records from Victorian asylums show children admitted for temporary conditions like bereavement-related depression or typhoid-induced delirium, who, once institutionalized, were reclassified into permanent categories, ensuring lifelong confinement. The system wasn't designed to cure, but to remove the inconvenient from society permanently. Family contact was minimized or eliminated. Many asylums restricted visits based on theories that family upset institutional routine or triggered negative behaviors. Some permitted monthly or quarterly visits. Others allowed only annual contact or none at all. Letters were censored or withheld entirely. Parents seeking information about their children's condition often received minimal standardized responses, regardless of actual status. The deliberate severing of family bonds wasn't considered harmful, but therapeutically necessary to establish institutional control. Many children effectively disappeared into asylum systems, their subsequent lives and deaths unrecorded in family histories. The psychological impact of institutionalization was devastating and self-reinforcing. Children developed what we would now recognize as institutional syndrome, becoming passive, withdrawn, and unable to function independently. These acquired behaviors were interpreted not as responses to institutional conditions, but as confirmation of underlying pathology, justifying continued confinement. The more damaged children became from institutional life, the more they were seen as requiring that very institutionalization. The system created the very conditions it purported to treat. Death rates in asylums far exceeded the general population, with child mortality particularly high. Official inquests typically attributed deaths to natural causes or pre-existing conditions rather than institutional neglect or abuse. When investigations did occur, they were generally conducted by local worthies with personal or professional relationships to asylum administrators. Records were often falsified to conceal systematic problems or individual abuses. The dead received pauper burials in unmarked graves, their passing noted with the same bureaucratic indifference that characterized their treatment in life. Perhaps most disturbing was how easily children entered asylum systems through ordinary social mechanisms. Teachers reported students with learning differences. Employers brought troublesome child workers to medical attention. Religious authorities identified children with unnatural tendencies. Neighbors reported unusual behaviors in local children. The asylum system wasn't imposed solely from above, but maintained through community participation in identifying and removing those who didn't fit increasingly narrow definitions of normality. Few questioned whether institutions actually helped those committed to them. The economic exploitation embedded in the asylum system added another layer of injustice. Patients, including children, provided free labor for institutional maintenance, farming, laundry, cleaning, and manufacturing. This labor wasn't therapeutic, but essential to institutional operations, creating financial incentives to maintain high patient populations. Families with money paid substantial fees for better accommodations and treatment, while poor children were warehoused in minimal conditions that still generated profit through their unpaid labor. The system wasn't just clinically questionable, but economically exploitative. By the late Victorian period, reformers began challenging the worst asylum abuses, though progress came slowly. The 1890 Lunacy Act established slightly more rigorous commitment procedures and mandatory inspections, though implementation remained inconsistent. Various mental deficiency colonies were established as supposedly more humane alternatives to traditional asylums, though these often replicated the same fundamental problems in more attractive settings. True reform would require completely reconceptualizing approaches to developmental and psychological differences, a task that extended well beyond the Victorian period. So there you are, a Victorian child whose developmental, psychological or behavioral differences have resulted in institutional commitment. You're separated from family, inadequately fed, poorly housed, routinely restrained, experimentally treated, educationally neglected, and psychologically broken. Your very existence is processed as a medical problem requiring containment rather than a human life deserving support and development. Your suffering isn't an unfortunate side effect of treatment, but the core mechanism of a system designed to warehouse the inconvenient and different. And society tells you this imprisonment is actually medical care for which you should show gratitude. In Victorian England, even the most vulnerable children had virtually no protection from those who would exploit and abuse them. And that's where our journey takes us next, into the dark world where predators operated with virtual impunity and society turned a blind eye to the systematic abuse of its youngest members. Part 12. You had no one to protect you from predators. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum, being treated like an adult without rights, perpetual hunger, back-breaking labor, absolute employer power, systematic violence, educational deprivation, the risk of being sold or given away, criminalization of homelessness, the horrors of the workhouse, and the threat of asylum for being different. But we've yet to explore perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Victorian childhood: the near-complete absence of protection from those who would deliberately harm children for their own gratification or profit. In Victorian England, predators targeting children operated with a freedom that would be inconceivable today, not because their activities were unknown, but because society's response ranged from indifference to active complicity. This wasn't a matter of different standards or ignorance about child development. It represented a profound failure to protect the most vulnerable members of society, despite clear evidence of harm. The Victorian era wasn't just dangerous for children through neglect or harsh conditions. It was actively dangerous through deliberate exploitation that went largely unchallenged. Let's start with the legal framework, which provided minimal protection at best. Until 1875, the age of consent for girls was just 13 years, meaning sexual activity with a 12-year-old was statutory rape, but with a 13-year-old was entirely legal regardless of power dynamics or exploitation. The 1875 law raised this age to 16, which was considered radical and faced significant opposition from those who argued it interfered with natural development and marriage prospects. No equivalent age of protection existed for boys, who were legally considered incapable of being sexually victimized, regardless of age or circumstances. The message was clear: children's bodies were legally available at remarkably young ages. Enforcement of even these minimal protections was almost non-existent. Police rarely investigated sexual crimes against children unless they involved extreme violence or death. Courts required standards of evidence that were nearly impossible to meet, especially from child victims. Testimony from working-class children was routinely dismissed as inherently unreliable. Medical evidence was collected incompetently, if at all. The few cases that resulted in convictions typically received sentences measured in months rather than years, with judges often expressing more concern about the damage to the perpetrator's reputation than harm to the child victim. The notorious maiden tribute scandal revealed the depth of the problem. In 1885, journalist W.T. Stead conducted an undercover investigation that documented how easily he could purchase a 13-year-old girl for sexual purposes. To prove his point, he actually completed such a purchase, though he did not personally abuse the child, demonstrating the open operation of child sex trafficking in London. His exposé in the Pall Mall Gazette created public outrage but also significant backlash against the messenger for discussing indecent topics publicly. The scandal finally pushed Parliament to raise the age of consent from 13 to 16, but the underlying market in child exploitation continued largely unabated. For working-class children, sexual exploitation was often an expected occupational hazard. Girls in domestic service were routinely victimized by male employers or their sons, with complaints typically resulting in dismissal rather than protection. Factory girls faced similar vulnerability from foremen and managers, with economic necessity forcing them to tolerate abuse to maintain employment. Street children engaged in various informal economies faced constant sexual predation, with police more likely to arrest them for vagrancy than protect them from exploitation. The children most in need of protection received the least. Institutional settings created perfect environments for systematic abuse. Orphanages, workhouses, schools, and asylums operated with minimal oversight and accountability. Staff had nearly absolute power over children in their care, creating conditions ripe for exploitation. When abuse was occasionally exposed through deaths or unusual injuries, investigations typically focused on individual bad apples rather than systemic failures that enabled abuse. Institutions investigated themselves with predictable results. Children who reported mistreatment were typically punished for lying or causing trouble. The language used to discuss child victims revealed much about Victorian attitudes. Girls who had been sexually abused were described as fallen, ruined, or corrupted, language that placed moral responsibility on the child rather than the adult perpetrator. Boys who reported abuse were labeled unnatural or suspected of inviting misconduct. The concept that children could be innocent victims of adult predation existed in sentimental literature, but rarely in legal or social welfare practice. Once victimized, children were viewed as irreparably damaged rather than deserving protection and support. Religious organizations that might have been expected to protect children often prioritized institutional reputation over child welfare. When abuse by clergy or staff in religious institutions was reported, the typical response was transferring the perpetrator to another location rather than removing them from contact with children. Victims and their families were counseled to forgive, remain silent, or consider how publicity might damage the church's mission. Some religious institutions actively covered up systematic abuse, with hierarchies protecting perpetrators through decades of predatory behavior affecting hundreds of children. Upper-class predators operated with particular impunity, protected by wealth, social connection, and class privilege. When accusations did emerge, they typically faced private responses, quiet settlements, hushed sanitarium stays, or discreet transfers to colonial postings, where they could continue predatory behavior with even less oversight. The justice system treated wealthy defendants with remarkable leniency when cases did reach court, with judges openly sympathetic to the momentary weakness of otherwise respectable gentlemen. The children they victimized, typically from lower social classes, were viewed as inherently less valuable and less worthy of protection. Medical response to child abuse ranged from incompetent to actively harmful. Physicians rarely received training in identifying abuse injuries, with obvious signs frequently attributed to accidents or children's natural roughness. When abuse was suspected, doctor-patient confidentiality was interpreted as protecting adult perpetrators rather than child victims. Some medical treatments for abuse injuries, particularly sexual trauma, created additional harm through painful, invasive procedures justified as restoring moral purity rather than addressing physical damage. Medicine that should have protected children often reinforced their victimization. What makes this systematic failure to protect children particularly damning is that it occurred alongside Victorian rhetoric about child innocence and the special duty of adults toward the young. The same society that published sentimental poetry about the sacred innocence of childhood and the angelic nature of children systematically failed to create basic protections against their exploitation. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as class-based application of different standards. Childhood innocence was for the protected middle and upper classes, while working-class children were viewed as inherently corrupt and therefore undeserving of similar protection. By the late Victorian period, some genuine progress began affecting the most visible forms of child exploitation, though changes came slowly and unevenly. Legislation gradually strengthened, enforcement occasionally improved, and public awareness increased through journalistic exposés and reformer campaigns. Yet the fundamental social attitudes that enabled exploitation, that children were property rather than persons, that some children were inherently less valuable than others, that protection was a charitable option rather than a right, remained largely intact, ensuring that many forms of abuse continued well into the 20th century. So there you are, a Victorian child navigating a world where those who should protect you may exploit you, where predators operate with virtual impunity, and where becoming a victim often leads to blame rather than support. Your body, your safety, and your dignity are accorded minimal value by legal systems, social institutions, and cultural attitudes. Your vulnerability isn't seen as creating special obligation for protection, but as opportunity for exploitation. And society tells you that whatever happens is probably your fault for being in the wrong place, looking the wrong way, or simply existing as the wrong kind of child. You've survived birth in a disease-ridden slum. You've endured being treated as a tiny adult with none of the rights. You've managed not to starve despite perpetual hunger. You've suffered through back-breaking labor that permanently damaged your body. You've survived the absolute power employers held over your existence. You've endured systematic violence and educational deprivation. You've avoided being sold or given away by your family. You've escaped imprisonment for homelessness, the horrors of the workhouse, and asylum commitment for being different. You've even somehow protected yourself from predators, despite society's indifference to your safety. Surely, if you'd been born wealthy, you'd have escaped all this suffering. Part 13. Even rich kids suffered, just differently. You've survived a litany of horrors that Victorian working-class children faced daily. But perhaps you're thinking, if only I'd been born wealthy, I could have escaped all this suffering. It's time to puncture that comforting illusion, because in Victorian England, even children of privilege existed in gilded cages, facing their own distinctive forms of systematic abuse and neglect. The suffering may have looked different, wrapped in fine clothing and proper elocution, but its psychological impact was often just as devastating. Let's start with the most fundamental relationship, that between parents and children. Modern wealthy families typically emphasize emotional bonds and quality time. Victorian upper-class families operated on almost the opposite principle. Parental detachment wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but the core design feature of proper child rearing. Wealthy children were raised primarily by servants, with parental contact limited to brief, formal interactions. A typical upper-class child might see their mother for perhaps an hour daily, and their father even less. This emotional detachment wasn't considered neglectful, but appropriate preparation for the emotional restraint expected in upper-class adult life. The nursery system physically separated children from family life. Wealthy children occupied separate quarters, often on the top floor of large houses, deliberately isolated from adult living areas. Meals were taken separately, play was confined to designated spaces, and children appeared in adult company only when specifically summoned, properly cleaned and dressed for inspection. This wasn't just physical separation, but emotional quarantine, designed to prevent children from disrupting adult life while simultaneously protecting them from corrupting adult influences. The result was profound isolation, even within supposedly intact families. Childcare was delegated almost entirely to servants whose qualifications varied wildly. Nannies, governesses, tutors, and nursery maids might be devoted caretakers or abusive tyrants. Children had no choice in who raised them and no recourse against mistreatment. Servants held nearly absolute power within nursery domains, with parents rarely intervening in disciplinary matters. Physical punishment, emotional manipulation, and psychological control tactics were standard management techniques. Children who complained about servant treatment were typically punished for ingratitude or lying, creating perfect conditions for exploitation to continue unchallenged. The emotional repression required of upper-class children was relentless and comprehensive. Boys were taught from earliest childhood that displaying emotion indicated weakness and lack of proper masculine control. Girls learned that proper femininity required subordinating all personal desires to social expectations. Natural childish exuberance, curiosity, fear, or sadness were treated as behavioral problems requiring correction rather than normal developmental experiences requiring support. Children learned to perform emotional restraint long before they developed actual emotional regulation capabilities, creating profound disconnection between internal experience and external presentation. Physical affection was minimal or non-existent. Victorian children's manuals for the upper classes explicitly warned against excessive demonstrations of love, which supposedly created weak, dependent children. Hugs, kisses, and comfort during distress were deliberately withheld to promote self-reliance and emotional control. Even infants received limited physical contact beyond necessary care procedures. Children learned early that seeking physical comfort was inappropriate and indicated personal weakness rather than normal human need. This touch deprivation occurred during critical developmental periods when physical contact is essential for proper neurological development. Educational expectations created enormous pressure even on very young children. Wealthy boys faced rigorous academic preparation beginning around age 4, with numerous subjects taught simultaneously by demanding tutors. Failure brought shame and punishment rather than additional support. Girls received less academic education but faced equally rigorous training in social accomplishments. Music, drawing, needlework, languages, and deportment required perfect performance under constant critical scrutiny. The goal wasn't joyful learning or personal development, but production of properly polished social performers who would maintain family status and make advantageous marriages. Public schools, exclusive boarding schools like Eton, Harrow, and Rugby, represented perhaps the most systematic abuse of privileged boys. Children, as young as 7, were sent away to these institutions, where brutal conditions were considered character building. The infamous fagging system essentially enslaved younger boys to older ones, creating hierarchies of abuse that normalized violence. Freezing dormitories, inadequate food, excessive physical punishment, and institutional bullying weren't bugs in the system, but features deliberately designed to toughen future leaders. Sexual abuse was rampant and rarely addressed. These weren't educational institutions so much as traumatic initiation rituals into ruling class masculinity. Girls faced different but equally damaging restrictions. Physical confinement began early, with proper feminine deportment requiring uncomfortable clothing that restricted movement and activities. Corset training often began before puberty, gradually tightening to achieve the tiny waists fashion demanded, regardless of internal organ damage. Exercise was limited to prevent masculine muscle development. Intellectual pursuits were discouraged beyond superficial accomplishments, with girls showing academic interest labeled unfeminine and unmarriageable. The message was clear: a girl's body and mind existed for display and eventual reproduction, not personal development or satisfaction. Health practices for wealthy children ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. Cold baths year-round were considered strengthening, regardless of resulting chilblains and respiratory infections. Diet was deliberately restricted, particularly for girls, to ensure proper slenderness. Various strengthening treatments involved painful procedures, justified as medical necessity, but essentially functioning as physical discipline. Children with genuine health conditions often received harmful treatments based on Victorian medical theories, now known to be completely incorrect. The physical comfort modern parents prioritize was considered actively harmful to proper development. Privacy didn't exist, even for the wealthiest children. Diaries were read, correspondence monitored, conversations with friends reported by chaperones. This surveillance wasn't considered intrusive, but proper parental oversight. Children learned early that their thoughts, feelings, and personal communications were subject to adult review and potential punishment. The psychological development of a private self, critical for healthy identity formation, was actively discouraged in favor of creating performative selves, always oriented toward external judgment and approval. Religious instruction emphasized sin, punishment, and unworthiness rather than comfort or spiritual connection. Children's religious education focused heavily on their inherent moral corruption and need for rigorous self-discipline to avoid eternal damnation. Seemingly minor infractions like momentary selfishness or insufficient gratitude were treated as serious moral failings requiring repentance and correction. The concept of a loving deity was secondary to that of a judging one, creating profound anxiety in developing minds. Religion that might have provided comfort instead became another source of perfectionist pressure and fear of inadequacy. Physical discipline might have been somewhat less brutal than in working-class contexts, but it remained systematic and physical. Caning was standard practice in elite boys' schools, with punishments recorded in formal ledgers and sometimes conducted as public spectacles. Girls typically received less overtly violent discipline but often endured stress positions, food deprivation, or isolation as punishment. The psychological dimension was emphasized for wealthy children. Shame and family disappointment were leveraged to create internal rather than just external control. This wasn't gentler, just differently damaging. Emotional neglect was perhaps the most pervasive form of abuse in wealthy households. Children's emotional needs were considered largely irrelevant to proper development. Homesickness at boarding school was treated as shameful weakness rather than normal attachment. Grief over deaths was to be processed privately and quickly, with public displays considered inappropriate after brief formal mourning periods. Fears, insecurities, and normal developmental anxieties received minimal acknowledgement or support. The resulting emotional isolation created generations of adults unable to form healthy attachments or process normal emotions. Appearance standards created another layer of constant pressure. Children were dressed as miniature adults, in clothing designed for display rather than comfort or practicality. Boys endured restrictive formal wear from early ages. Girls were trained to tolerate increasingly constrictive garments as they approached marriage age. Looking proper at all times took precedence over physical comfort or freedom of movement. Children who complained about uncomfortable clothing were chastised for ingratitude and weakness. The body existed not for personal experience, but for social display, a lesson taught through daily physical restriction. Marriage particularly exemplified the commodification of wealthy children. Girls were explicitly prepared as marriage market goods, with their education, accomplishments, appearance, and behavior all calibrated to maximize value in a brutally competitive field. Boys were taught to evaluate prospective wives as breeding stock and social assets rather than companions. Marriages arranged primarily for financial or social advantage remained common throughout the Victorian period, with young people's emotional compatibility considered largely irrelevant to successful unions. Children understood early that their ultimate value lay in these transactions rather than their inherent worth as individuals. The psychological impact of this emotionally barren, performance-focused upbringing created distinctive patterns of dysfunction. Victorian literature and medical records document high rates of what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, and psychosomatic conditions among upper-class young people. Girls in particular experienced nervous collapse around marriage age with such regularity it was considered almost normal. Boys developed emotional numbing that enabled colonial administration and military service while creating profound interpersonal dysfunction. These weren't individual pathologies but predictable outcomes of systematically damaging child-rearing practices. Perhaps most disturbing was how this systematic emotional neglect was explicitly theorized and justified. This wasn't accidental harm but deliberate practice based on specific beliefs about proper development. Children's manuals for the wealthy explicitly advocated emotional distance, limited physical affection, rigid discipline, and prioritization of social performance over internal well-being. The damage wasn't a bug, but a feature, creating adults who would maintain existing social systems regardless of personal cost. The goal wasn't happy children, but properly functioning social units who would preserve class boundaries and imperial power. By the late Victorian period, some reform movements began challenging these practices within wealthy families, though change came slowly. The new education movement advocated more humane approaches to learning. Some progressive parents began questioning traditional emotional restriction and physical discipline. Various healthcare reformers challenged damaging practices like tight corseting of young girls. Yet, these remained minority positions, with traditional approaches to upper-class child-rearing continuing largely unchanged into the early 20th century. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning exactly as designed to reproduce class position at the expense of individual flourishing. So there you are, a Victorian child of privilege. You live in material comfort, surrounded by servants who raise you with minimal parental contact. Your education is extensive but joyless. Your physical needs met, but your emotional needs ignored. Your body is confined in uncomfortable clothing. Your behavior constantly monitored for proper performance. Your natural development subordinated to social expectations at every turn. Your future is predetermined by family requirements rather than personal inclination. And society tells you how fortunate you are to be born into such privilege, making any unhappiness seem like personal failing rather than systemic harm. You've survived a comprehensive tour of Victorian childhood horrors across class lines. Whether born in slums or mansions, Victorian children faced systematic abuse, justified as proper development. The specific forms varied, but the underlying principle remained constant. Children existed as resources to be shaped for adult purposes, rather than persons with inherent value and rights. But beyond all these specific horrors, there's an overarching tragedy to Victorian childhood, the profound sense that the world simply didn't care about children as people. And that's where our journey takes us for our penultimate stop. Part 14. You were always replaceable. Throughout our exploration of Victorian childhood horrors, an underlying theme has emerged that deserves explicit examination: the profound replaceability of children in Victorian society. Beyond all the specific abuses, beyond the class-specific sufferings, a fundamental reality shaped every child's experience. They were replaceable units rather than irreplaceable individuals. This wasn't just a social attitude, but a structural reality that influenced every aspect of how children were treated, across all social classes and contexts. Let's start with the most literal form of replaceability: the demographic reality of high birth rates. Victorian families, particularly working-class ones, typically produced many children in quick succession. This wasn't simply due to lack of contraception, though that certainly contributed, but reflected economic and social strategy in a world of high child mortality. When children frequently died, having many increased the chances that some would survive to adulthood. This practical approach to reproduction created an almost inevitable devaluation of individual children. They were potential assets, measured in quantity rather than unique beings valued for their specific qualities. The naming patterns reveal much about this replaceability. Working-class families frequently reused the names of deceased children for new babies, sometimes multiple times if successive children died. This wasn't considered macabre but practical, preserving family names despite high mortality. Higher birth rates meant siblings often shared birth dates years apart. Children grew up knowing they carried the names of dead siblings, understanding their role as replacements for those who hadn't survived. Personal identity was subordinated to family continuity, with individual children serving as interchangeable carriers of lineage rather than unique persons. The economic value of children reinforced their replaceability. Factory owners explicitly discussed child workers as interchangeable units, calculating how many would be used up through work accidents, disease or exhaustion, and factoring replacement costs into business models. When a child worker became too injured or ill to function effectively, they were simply replaced with another from the seemingly endless supply of poor children needing income. This wasn't considered problematic, but normal business practice, the same calculation one might make about replacing worn machinery parts. Even in upper-class contexts, children's replaceability operated through different but equally dehumanizing mechanisms. Heirs were necessary for dynastic continuity, but which specific child fulfilled this role was less important than that the role was filled. A prominent Victorian saying advised wealthy families to produce an heir and a spare, explicitly framing children as backup systems for family continuity rather than individuals. Girls were valued primarily as marriage assets, their individual personalities relevant only insofar as they enhanced or detracted from market value. The system wasn't failing, it was functioning exactly as designed to produce interchangeable social units rather than unique individuals. Educational systems reinforced this replaceability through standardization rather than personalization. Victorian schools weren't designed to develop individual potential, but to produce specified types of adults needed by industrial society and imperial administration. Working-class education created compliant factory workers, middle-class education produced reliable clerks and managers, upper-class education manufactured imperial administrators and military officers. Individual aptitudes, interests, or needs were largely irrelevant to these predetermined outcomes. Children who couldn't fit these molds weren't accommodated but discarded as defective units. The welfare systems handling vulnerable children operated explicitly on principles of replaceability. Orphanage and workhouse records show children assigned identification numbers rather than consistently using names, processed through institutional systems with minimal recognition of individual needs or characteristics. When children died in these institutions, which happened with alarming frequency, they were quickly replaced by new admissions, their beds barely cold before being reassigned. Administrative records focused on maintaining appropriate institutional populations rather than tracking individual outcomes or development. Colonial education programs demonstrated replaceability on imperial scale. The British Empire's various civilization projects treated indigenous children as raw material to be processed into anglicized substitutes for their community's traditional next generation. Children were deliberately alienated from native cultures and languages, with successful education measured by how completely original identities were erased and replaced with approved imperial versions. This wasn't hidden or incidental, but the explicit goal creating interchangeable colonial subjects rather than supporting development within indigenous cultural frameworks. The medical treatment of children reflected similar attitudes. Hospital records show children frequently identified by condition rather than name, with treatment standardized by diagnosis rather than individualized by specific needs. When medical experiments required test subjects, institutionalized children were used with minimal concern for consent or individual outcomes. The development of pediatrics as a specialty came late in the Victorian period, precisely because children were long viewed as small adults rather than developing individuals with specific medical needs. This wasn't ignorance but conceptual framing, children as categories rather than persons. Religious attitudes reinforced replaceability through emphasis on children as bearers of original sin, requiring correction rather than unique souls deserving nurture. The focus on breaking children's will rather than supporting their development created interchangeable followers rather than distinctive spiritual beings. When children died, religious consolation emphasized replaceable status. God will send another, or God needed another angel, rather than acknowledging the unique and irreplaceable loss each child represented. This wasn't coincidental but doctrinal. Children as instances of sinful humanity rather than unique divine creations. The language used to discuss children revealed profound replaceability assumptions. Terms like the child rather than specific names appear constantly in Victorian writing about childhood, creating generic rather than individual subjects. Phrases like surplus population or excess children appear in discussions of poverty, explicitly framing some children as unnecessary and therefore disposable. Even seemingly positive generalizations about childhood innocence or childish wonder created generic categories rather than recognizing individual experiences. Children existed as a concept rather than as specific persons. The institutional response to child death particularly revealed replaceability attitudes. Workhouses, schools, factories, and mines recorded child deaths as administrative events, requiring paperwork rather than human tragedies, requiring reflection or change. The same systems that meticulously tracked productivity, attendance, and inventory often maintained only minimal records about children who died while under institutional care. When investigations occurred, they typically focused on property damage or procedural compliance rather than the human value of the lost child. Administrative systems weren't failing, they were functioning exactly as designed, processing replaceable units rather than caring for irreplaceable individuals. Even parental grief reflected these social attitudes, with mourning practices varying dramatically by class and circumstances. While Victorian culture developed elaborate mourning rituals, these were applied unevenly, with working-class child deaths often marked minimally, if at all. Middle and upper-class families might observe formal mourning for children who lived long enough to develop social presence, but infant deaths frequently received minimal commemoration. The prevailing advice to bereaved parents emphasized replacement rather than remembrance. Have another child quickly to fill the gap, rather than dwelling on the irreplaceable nature of the lost one. The photographic record tells a similar story. Post-mortem photography, taking pictures of deceased family members, was common Victorian practice. For many poor children, the only photograph ever taken of them was after death, their individuality recognized only when it was permanently lost. In life, they were functional units. In death, they briefly became subjects worthy of commemoration before being replaced by the next child in the seemingly endless supply of working-class offspring. This wasn't neglect, but economic reality. Photography was expensive, children were plentiful, and documentation of living children was a luxury rather than a necessity. Child replacement operated intergenerationally, creating cycles of interchangeability. Children raised as replaceable units became adults who viewed their own children similarly, perpetuating systems that processed rather than nurtured young humans. The emotional detachment necessary to survive in systems that devalued individual children became parenting practice that created the next generation of emotionally detached adults. This wasn't failure but replication. Social systems reproducing the psychological patterns needed for their continuity, regardless of human cost. What makes Victorian child replaceability particularly damning is that it operated alongside emerging understanding of child development that emphasized individual differences and needs. By mid-Victorian period, progressive educators, physicians, and social reformers were documenting the importance of individual attention, emotional connection, and personalized development for healthy childhood outcomes. This evidence was largely ignored by mainstream institutions and practices, not from ignorance but from systemic investment in maintaining replaceability as an operating principle. The knowledge was available, society chose to disregard it. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began challenging these replaceability assumptions, though progress came slowly and unevenly. Various child welfare organizations pushed for recognition of individual children's needs and rights. Educational reformers advocated more personalized approaches to learning. Medical specialization in pediatrics finally acknowledged children's distinct developmental requirements. Yet these remained minority positions, with traditional views of children as interchangeable units continuing to dominate institutional practices and social policies well into the 20th century. Perhaps most disturbing was how this replaceability ethic directly contradicted Victorian sentimental rhetoric about the precious nature of childhood. The same society that produced tear-jerking poetry about the specialness of children operated systems that treated them as standardized, interchangeable units. This wasn't simple hypocrisy, but compartmentalization. Childhood as an abstract concept could be precious while actual children remained replaceable. The gap between cultural idealization and practical treatment revealed the fundamental disconnect between Victorian sentimentality and brutal socio-economic reality. So there you are, a Victorian child whose fundamental experience is knowing that you are replaceable. Whether in family, school, work, or institutional settings, you understand that you are an instance of a category rather than an irreplaceable individual. Your specific qualities, needs, desires, and potential are largely irrelevant to the social systems processing you toward predetermined outcomes. Your value lies not in who you are, but in how effectively you fulfill prescribed functions, and should you fail, falter, or perish, another child stands ready to take your place with minimal disruption to the systems that never really saw you as an individual in the first place. You've survived our comprehensive tour of Victorian childhood horrors. You've endured conditions that killed many of your peers and damaged all who survived. You've navigated systems explicitly designed to extract maximum utility from your body and spirit while providing minimal support for your development and well-being. You've somehow maintained some sense of self, despite constant messaging that you are replaceable, disposable, and valuable only for your functionality rather than your humanity. And all of this has left permanent marks not just on your body, but on your developing mind and spirit. Because beyond all these specific horrors lies the ultimate tragedy of Victorian childhood, the devastating psychological impact of growing up, knowing that the world doesn't care about you as an individual person. And that's where our journey concludes. Part 15, you grew up knowing the world didn't care about you. We've explored 14 specific horrors of Victorian childhood, from deadly disease-ridden slums to lack of legal rights, from starvation amid plenty to brutal child labor, from unchecked employer power to systematic physical abuse, from educational deprivation to being sold or given away, from criminalization of homelessness to workhouse horrors, from asylum imprisonment to vulnerability to predators, from the distinctive sufferings of wealthy children to the profound replaceability of all children, regardless of class. But beyond these specific traumas lies perhaps the most devastating aspect of Victorian childhood, the psychological impact of growing up in a world that fundamentally didn't care about you as a person. This isn't about individual Victorian adults being cruel or uncaring. Many genuinely loved the children in their lives and did their best within prevailing social frameworks. The tragedy lies deeper in systemic and institutional indifference to children's humanity that permeated Victorian society at all levels. Children grew up in a world where social systems, legal frameworks, economic structures, and cultural attitudes consistently prioritized their utility over their humanity. The psychological impact of this systemic indifference created damage that outlasted specific physical traumas and shaped generations of survivors. Let's examine what it meant to develop as a human being in this context of fundamental disregard. The most basic psychological need of developing children is secure attachment, the sense that caregivers are reliably available, responsive to distress, and emotionally attuned. Victorian child-rearing practices across classes actively worked against this attachment security. Working-class parents, struggling for survival, had minimal time or resources for attuned caregiving. Upper-class parents deliberately maintained emotional distance as proper child-rearing practice. Institutional care specifically prevented attachment formation through constant staff changes and prohibitions on affectionate relationships. The foundation of secure psychological development was systematically undermined for most Victorian children. The development of basic trust, the fundamental sense that the world is reasonably safe and responsive to needs, was similarly compromised. Victorian children learned early and repeatedly that their needs were secondary to adult convenience, institutional requirements, or economic imperatives. Expressions of pain, fear, hunger, or emotional distress typically brought minimization, dismissal, or punishment rather than responsive care. This wasn't occasional neglect, but systematic invalidation of children's lived experience as irrelevant to the adult world. The result wasn't just momentary suffering, but the development of core beliefs about fundamental unworthiness that shaped lifelong psychological functioning. Identity formation, the process of developing a coherent sense of self, requires reflection from caregivers who see and respond to a child's unique characteristics, preferences, and developing personality. Victorian children rarely received this mirroring. Working-class children were defined primarily by economic utility, upper-class children by social role requirements, institutional children by administrative categories. Individual temperament, interests, aptitudes, and preferences were largely irrelevant to how children were treated across all social contexts. Without external recognition of their unique qualities, children struggled to develop internal understanding of who they were beyond their functional roles. Emotional development suffered particularly profound damage. Victorian children across classes actively suppressed emotional expression and awareness. Working-class children learned that expressing pain, fear, or distress only brought punishment or dismissal. Upper-class children were explicitly trained to suppress emotion as weakness. Institutional children discovered that emotional display marked them for additional control measures. This wasn't just momentary suppression, but the systematic creation of alexithymia, the inability to identify and express emotions that persisted into adulthood and across generations. Victorian literature reveals this pattern in its emotional flatness punctuated by melodramatic excess, mirroring the psychological patterns created by systematic emotional suppression. The development of agency and self-efficacy, the sense that one can affect one's circumstances through action, was systematically undermined. Victorian children across classes had minimal control over even basic aspects of daily life. Working-class children's labor was directed by employers with absolute authority. Upper-class children's days were regimented by nurses, governesses, and tutors enforcing rigid schedules and behaviors. Institutional children lived under complete external control of daily activities. This wasn't preparation for independence, but training in helplessness, creating adults who expected external control rather than internal agency, regardless of class position. Moral development suffered distinctive distortion. Victorian children were bombarded with moral instruction, emphasizing obedience, self-denial, and acceptance of hierarchy as primary virtues. Questioning authority, asserting needs, or challenging unfair treatment were framed as moral failings rather than healthy development. This wasn't ethical education, but compliance training, creating adults who equated morality with submission to authority rather than principled ethical reasoning. The distinctive Victorian combination of public moral rigidity and private moral flexibility reflected this developmental distortion, external compliance coexisting with undeveloped internal ethical frameworks. Cognitive development, the ability to think critically, solve problems, and conceptualize abstractly, was explicitly limited by educational practices across classes. Working-class education emphasized rote learning and practical skills rather than analytical thinking. Upper-class education focused on classical knowledge and proper form rather than innovative thought. Both approaches discouraged questioning, exploration, and independent conclusion drawing. This wasn't educational failure, but deliberate design, creating adults who would maintain existing systems rather than imagining alternatives. The few Victorian intellectual innovators succeeded, despite rather than because of their education. The development of healthy relationship patterns was systematically undermined. Victorian children learned relationship models characterized by power imbalance, emotional withholding, and conditional regard based on utility or compliance rather than intrinsic value. Working-class children observed parents struggling for survival with minimal emotional resources. Upper-class children witnessed marriages based on property exchange rather than emotional connection. Institutional children had no models of sustained caring relationships at all. This wasn't accidental but systemic, creating adults who replicated these patterns in their own relationships, perpetuating cycles of emotional disconnection across generations. What psychological theorists call the internal working model, the core mental representation of self and others that guides relationship expectations, developed in distinctly damaged forms. Victorian children internalized models where the self was valuable only for utility, where needs were inappropriate impositions on others, where emotional vulnerability invited exploitation rather than care, and where protection came through compliance rather than connection. This wasn't just childhood adaptation but lifelong orientation, creating adults who expected and often recreated the same conditional, utility-based relationships they had experienced as children. The psychological concept of the true self, the authentic core of personality, preference, and potential, was systematically suppressed in favor of what we would now call the false self, a compliant, adaptive mask meeting external expectations, regardless of internal experience. Victorian children learned early that survival, approval, and minimal safety required performing acceptable roles rather than expressing authentic feelings, needs, or characteristics. This wasn't temporary adaptation, but fundamental personality formation, creating adults who frequently had minimal connection to their own authentic desires, preferences, or potentials. The capacity for play, not just as recreation, but as the fundamental developmental process through which children explore possibilities, process experiences, and develop creativity, was systematically restricted. Working-class children had minimal time or energy for play between work demands. Upper-class children experienced highly regulated, appropriate play focused on role preparation rather than exploration. Institutional children faced punishment for spontaneous play that disrupted organizational efficiency. This wasn't just denying fun, but actively preventing a crucial developmental process, creating adults with limited creativity, adaptability, and capacity for joy. Perhaps most devastating was the development of what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses that shaped lifelong functioning. Victorian children across classes experienced what trauma specialists identify as the core conditions for developmental trauma: prolonged exposure to danger, inability to escape, and absence of protective intervention. The resulting adaptations, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, identity disturbance, relationship difficulties, and distorted belief systems about self and others, weren't individual pathologies, but predictable outcomes of systematically traumatic child-rearing practices. Victorian society wasn't raising children, it was creating trauma survivors. The intergenerational transmission of these psychological patterns created damage extending far beyond individual lifespans. Children raised without secure attachment became adults unable to provide secure attachment to their own children. Those who learned emotions were dangerous raised children to fear their own feelings. Individuals who developed compliant false selves created environments where their children developed similar disconnection from authentic experience. This wasn't accidental but self-perpetuating. Trauma creating conditions for its own replication across generations, maintaining social systems through psychological damage passed from parent to child, regardless of conscious intention. What makes this psychological devastation particularly damning is that it occurred alongside emerging understanding of child development that could have prevented it. By mid-Victorian period, Progressive educators, physicians, and social reformers were documenting the importance of emotional connection, responsive care, and support for individual development in creating healthy outcomes. This evidence was largely ignored by mainstream institutions and practices, not from ignorance, but from systemic investment in maintaining existing social structures regardless of human cost. The knowledge was available. Society chose to disregard it in favor of producing properly functioning social units rather than flourishing human beings. By the late Victorian period, reform movements began challenging these psychologically destructive practices, though progress came slowly and unevenly. Various child welfare organizations advocated approaches recognizing children's emotional needs as legitimate. Educational reformers promoted more supportive, individualized learning environments. Medical understanding gradually acknowledged the psychological dimension of child development alongside physical health. Yet these remained minority positions, with traditional approaches continuing to dominate institutional practices and social policies well into the 20th century. The legacy of Victorian psychological damage extended far beyond the period itself, shaping subsequent generations through both direct transmission of trauma patterns and institutional continuation of harmful practices. Contemporary psychologists and trauma specialists increasingly recognize how many modern mental health issues, relationship patterns, and social dysfunctions trace their roots to Victorian approaches to childhood that privilege compliance and utility over well-being and development. The damage didn't end when the Victorian era concluded. It continued reproducing itself across generations through both interpersonal relationships and institutional structures. So there you are, a Victorian child developing in a world fundamentally indifferent to your humanity. You've survived our comprehensive tour of Victorian childhood horrors, from physical conditions that damaged bodies to psychological environments that warped developing minds. The contrast between Victorian pretensions and Victorian realities remains the most damning indictment of the era. A society that controlled a quarter of the globe's land and wealth chose to subject its own children to conditions of deliberate suffering while claiming moral superiority over primitive cultures that often treated children with greater humanity. A culture that produced tear-jerking sentimental literature about the precious innocence of childhood operated economic and social systems that destroyed that innocence for profit and convenience. The hypocrisy wasn't incidental but fundamental, revealing the moral void at the heart of Victorian civilization. Modern viewers often feel a comfortable distance from Victorian horrors, assuming we've progressed beyond such treatment of children. This complacency deserves challenging. While specific forms of exploitation have changed, many underlying attitudes persist in modified forms. Children remain economically exploited globally through supply chains producing goods for wealthy nations. Educational systems still often prioritize compliance over development. Economic imperatives still supersede children's needs in policy decisions. The psychological patterns established in Victorian times continue reproducing themselves through familial and institutional practices. The past isn't as distant as we might wish to believe. Perhaps the most important lesson from this exploration is how systems of child exploitation persist, not through conspiracy, but through normalization. The acceptance of harmful practices as simply the way things are. Victorian child labor, educational brutality, and institutional abuse weren't hidden horrors, but open practices justified by prevailing economic theories, religious beliefs, and social attitudes. The greatest protection against repeating such systematic harm is refusing this normalization, consistently questioning whether our treatment of society's most vulnerable members reflects our stated values or reveals their fundamental hypocrisy. The Victorian example shows how easily a society can inflict massive harm on children while simultaneously proclaiming their special value. As we conclude this journey through Victorian childhood, remember that these weren't just historical curiosities, but lived experiences that shaped generations. The children who survived these systems, Our great-grandparents and their parents carried the physical and psychological marks throughout their lives, passing modified versions of their adaptive patterns to subsequent generations. Understanding this history helps explain not just the Victorian period, but aspects of our own social patterns, parenting approaches, educational systems, and institutional structures that continue reflecting these historical damages. The past isn't past, it lives in our present through these intergenerational transmissions. The children of Victorian England deserved better, not just better physical conditions, but recognition of their fundamental humanity beyond their utility to adult systems. They deserved protection, nurturing, responsive care, and support for their individual development rather than processing toward predetermined social roles, regardless of personal cost. That they largely didn't receive this basic recognition reveals not just historical contingency, but deliberate choices made by a society that prioritized profit, empire, and social stability over human flourishing. The true measure of any civilization lies not in its monuments, wealth, or power, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members. By this standard, Victorian England stands profoundly condemned. So ends our exploration of why it sucked to be a child in Victorian England, a comprehensive tour through physical horrors, institutional abuses, and psychological damages that shaped generations. The children who endured these systems deserve remembrance not as faceless victims, but as individual humans who survived tremendous adversity, often at great personal cost. Their experiences matter not just as historical curiosities, but as warnings about how easily societies can normalize the systematic mistreatment of children while simultaneously proclaiming their special value. May we learn from their suffering rather than merely observing it from a comfortable historical distance.